Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. Evelyn had been traveling for hours, the landscape blurring behind her like the fragments of a forgotten dream. The letter she had received, handwritten and sealed with wax, had been cryptic, yet compelling. It spoke of a family connection she never knew existed, of secrets hidden in the forgotten corners of a mansion that had sat vacant for decades. Her pulse quickened with each passing mile, anticipation thrumming under her skin even as her unease grew. The air grew colder, the wind sharper as she neared the mansion. Her headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled over the winding road. It felt wrong. The world seemed to close in around her, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like the twisted hands of some ancient forsaken being. And then, there it was, the mansion. It loomed ahead, its silhouette barely visible against the inky blackness of the night. A great stone structure, its walls crumbling, windows like hollow eyes, its towering form seemed to exhale an unnatural chill into the air. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated. The mansion was more imposing than she had imagined, far older, its decay more evident than in the photograph she'd studied earlier. The wind whispered a soft warning, or perhaps it was simply her imagination. But she couldn't turn back now. With a sigh, Evelyn parked her car and stepped out into the cold. The crunch of gravel under her boots was the only sound, though it felt strangely muffled, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath. The fog rolled in thick, wrapping around her like an ethereal cloak. As she approached the front door, she noticed something strange. Footsteps in the wet dirt leading away from the entrance, but no one in sight. Her heart raced as she knocked, the hollow sound echoing unnervingly against the walls. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing the caretaker. Mr. Crane was taller than expected, his face gaunt, with skin so pale it almost seemed translucent in the dim light. His eyes, dark and unreadable, lingered on her for a long, unsettling moment before he spoke, his voice low, almost reverent. "Miss Evelyn, I presume? Come in. The house is waiting for you." She stepped inside, but the moment the door closed behind her, a strange heaviness settled over her chest. It wasn't just the oppressive silence that hung in the air, or the weight of years pressing down on the mansion's rotting bones. It was something else, something far darker. A sound echoed from somewhere deep inside the house. Thump, 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 like the slow, deliberate steps of something much older than time itself. The caretaker didn't seem to notice. "I'll show you to your room," Mr. Crane said, his tone almost too calm. "I trust you'll find everything to your liking." As he led her down a shadowed corridor, Evelyn's eyes darted from one door to another. The mansion was like a labyrinth, winding and narrow, each hallway darker than the last. But what truly unsettled her were the paintings that hung on the walls, portraits of men and women from a bygone era, pale faces, wide eyes. They were all staring at her, following her with a disturbing awareness. "Do not mind them," Mr. Crane muttered, noticing her gaze. "They watch everyone who enters. It's what they do." He stopped in front of a large, weathered door, unlocking it with a slow turn of the key. "Here we are. Rest well, Miss Evelyn. I will see you in the morning." As the door closed behind him, Evelyn felt the oppressive silence of the room wrap around her, suffocating her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching, waiting. The air tasted stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and something faintly sweet. But beneath it all, there was something darker, something ancient that clung to the very walls. She undressed quickly, almost in a hurry to settle into bed, though the unease gnawed at her. The quiet was too thick, the darkness too complete, and then she heard it, a faint scratching sound, like something trying to claw its way from beneath the floorboards. Her heart stopped. She strained her ears, listening. It came again, scritch, scratch, scritch. The noise was close, too close. Would she dare investigate? The scratching under the floorboards persisted, slow and deliberate, like the sound of fingers dragging across wood. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a violent reminder that she was alone, far from anyone who could hear her, in a house that felt anything but empty. She stood at the edge of the bed, her breath shallow, barely daring to move. The air seemed to thicken around her, growing heavier with each passing second. She waited. The scratching stopped, only to be replaced by a low groan, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from the very foundation of the house itself. The walls shuddered, as if the mansion was stretching its bones, waking from a long slumber. Evelyn pressed her back against the cold, unforgiving wall, her eyes darting around the room trying to make sense of the sounds, but seeing only shadows that seemed to whisper her name in the dark. Suddenly, the door creaked open. She hadn't heard anyone approach. But there, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Crane, his expression as unreadable as before, his pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the candle in his hand. His eyes didn't seem to focus on her at first. His gaze was distant, almost lost. "Is everything all right, Miss Evelyn?" His voice, though calm, held an undercurrent of something else, something far older than concern. She couldn't speak immediately, the words caught in her throat. The weight of his presence felt like an intrusion, a shadow that loomed in the doorway, blocking the light. The silence between them stretched thin, tight enough to snap. I thought I heard something," she finally managed, her voice a shaky whisper. His lips twitched, a fraction of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You are not the first to hear it. The house speaks, in its own way, but it is not always something one should listen to." His words hung in the air, each one carrying a strange resonance, as though they were meant for more than just her. He stepped into the room, his candlelight flickering in the stale air, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Evelyn stepped back, her mind racing. What did he mean? The house speaks? She forced herself to focus. What do you mean by that?" Mr. Crane paused, and for the first time since she met him, there was a glimmer of something unspoken in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps a warning. "Some places, some things, do not welcome strangers." He said softly, the words slow, deliberate. "You would do well to heed its warnings." He turned and walked toward the door, his long, sweeping coat brushing against the floor. For a moment, Evelyn was certain she had imagined the brief shift in his posture, the way he seemed to stiffen, almost as if an unseen weight had pressed down on him. Just before he left, he turned to her, his candlelight flickering in the doorway like a dying star. "Sleep well, Miss Evelyn. The night is long." And with that, the door closed behind him. Evelyn stared at the spot where he had stood. Sleep well. In a house that whispered and groaned, where shadows moved with a life of their own, where the floorboards spoke in scratches and the walls carried memories of things better forgotten. Her chest tightened again, but not from fear. No, not yet. The dread was something deeper, something more ancient, like the pulse of the earth itself, thrumming beneath her feet. It was the sense that she was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and that something far older than Mr. Crane had been waiting for her arrival. As she lay back on the bed, the scratching began again, closer this time, more insistent. But this time, Evelyn did not try to ignore it. She got up, her legs unsteady but determined, and reached for the old iron candlestick that sat on the nightstand. A flash of movement caught her eye, a shadow that lingered just outside her vision, dancing. On the edge of the darkness she turned. The room was empty, but she wasn't alone. The next morning, Evelyn woke to an unsettling silence, the kind that presses against your ears and fills the air with an oppressive weight. She rose from the bed slowly, stretching stiff limbs as she attempted to shake off the remnants of a restless night. The scratching beneath the floorboards had ceased, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a presence that clung to her like a second skin. She couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something was off, but the promise of answers was too strong to ignore. Perhaps the mansion held secrets, real secrets, that could explain the strange occurrences. Her mind wandered to the letters, to the invitations from her distant relative, all of it wrapped in a shroud of mystery she couldn't yet pierce. She dressed quickly, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone or something to be standing there. But it was empty. Only the soft rustling of the fog outside pressed in from beyond the windows, giving the mansion an eerie, desolate feel. When she made her way downstairs, the house seemed to shift around her. The air felt thicker, the shadows in the corners deeper, as though the walls themselves were subtly leaning in to listen to her every move. Mr. Crane was nowhere to be found. Perhaps he was tending to his duties, or perhaps the house had simply swallowed him whole. Either way, Evelyn had no time to waste. She was here for answers. She made her way down a narrow corridor, following the smell of old paper and dust, until she reached a large wooden door. The word library was engraved on it in faded gold letters, the metal tarnished with age. As her fingers touched the handle, a chill passed over her, a warning, a hesitation. She couldn't explain it, but she felt drawn to it. With a push, the door groaned open. The room inside was vast, its shelves lined with leather-bound books that stretched to the ceiling. The scent of old ink, mildew, and paper filled the air, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Dust floated in the air, caught in the dim light streaming through tall, narrow windows, and the place seemed to hum with the weight of forgotten knowledge. The books were in disarray, some stacked neatly, others piled haphazardly, their spines cracked and faded, each one seemingly holding a story older than the house itself. At first, Evelyn felt a sense of awe. This was what she had come for. The records, the journals, the forgotten histories. This was the treasure trove of secrets, all waiting for her to uncover. But as her fingers brushed across the first row of books, something odd happened. A flicker. A quick shadow moved across the farthest shelves, so brief she couldn't tell if it had been real or simply a trick of the light. She froze, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called softly, her voice too loud in the vast emptiness of the room. The sound of it echoed back at her, distorted, almost mocking. Nothing answered. The silence pressed in once more, thick and suffocating. Evelyn stepped deeper into the room, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The shelves were crowded with books she could not recognize. Strange symbols marked their spines, written in languages she couldn't decipher. Some were bound in what appeared to be human skin, others in faded cloth, their pages brittle to the touch. One book in particular caught her eye. It was tucked away on a higher shelf, almost as if someone had tried to hide it. A thick, leather-bound volume, its edges worn, its title illegible. As her fingers closed around it, a coldness spread through her. The book seemed to resist her touch, pulling her hand down with an almost deliberate force. She yanked it free from the shelf, the weight of it heavy in her hands, and then the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, and the air grew thick, as though the very space around her had begun to tighten. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. Something was coming. She opened the book, its pages stiff and crackling. As she flipped through them, she found what she had been hoping for: records, journals, sketches. But the further she read, the more she began to feel the creeping sensation of dread. The entries weren't just old. They were wrong. They detailed rituals, ceremonies, and strange occurrences she couldn't explain. References to them, the ancient ones, whose names were scrawled in a language she could not comprehend. At the very back of the book there was a final entry, written in hurried, trembling handwriting. "It is too late. They are awake. They see me now. If you read this, leave. The house is alive. It will take you." The words blurred in front of her, eyes, the letters twisting as if they were alive, fighting against her comprehension. Her breath caught in her throat, panic beginning to claw at her chest. And then, without warning, the light flickered. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching out toward her, their edges jagged and twisting like dark tendrils. A whisper, soft at first, then louder, closer, drifted through the air. "Leave." Evelyn slammed the book, shut, her heart racing. But the whispering didn't stop. It was everywhere, surrounding her now, a chorus of voices rising in the corners of the library. "Leave. Leave. Leave." It was all she could hear, all she could feel, the very walls pulsing with it. Her breath quickened. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Crane, watching her with those same dark, unblinking eyes. "It is time for you to leave," he said, his voice cold, flat, devoid of warmth. "You should have listened." And then, before she could respond, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping her inside the darkening room. Evelyn's breath was ragged in her chest as she stood in the middle of the library, the air thick with the oppressive silence that seemed to suffocate the room. Her fingers trembled against the edges of the book she had just slammed shut. But the whispering continued. It wasn't just a faint sound anymore. It was a presence, a constant murmuring presence that curled around her like smoke. "Leave. Leave." The voices were becoming more distinct, more urgent. The walls groaned. Again, the sound low and guttural, as if the house itself were alive, breathing in sync with her panic. She turned toward the door. But it was no longer open. The threshold was sealed shut, a heavy darkness pressing against it like something ancient and immovable. The warmth from the flickering candle she still clutched in her hand was no comfort. The shadows swallowed the light, stretching across the walls like twisted fingers. Her heart pounded in her ears, and her thoughts raced. Was this a warning, or something else? She looked back at Mr. Crane. His figure in the doorway had not moved. He simply stood there, watching her with an unsettling calm. The candlelight did nothing to pierce the depths of his expression. It was as though he were made of shadows, standing in the void. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, the silence swallowed her whole. It was a suffocating, unnatural silence, the kind that made her feel small, insignificant, like an insect trapped under glass. The longer she stood there, the more she felt the house closing in, pressing down on her. The air tasted heavy, almost metallic. "You shouldn't have read it," Mr. Crane finally said, his voice low, almost too calm, as though he were speaking to her as one would speak to a child. "It was never meant for you." The words sent a chill through Evelyn's bones. Something in the back of her mind screamed, "Don't trust him, don't listen, get out now." But her body was frozen, her legs heavy, unwilling to move. Mr. Crane stepped forward, his shoes echoing loudly on the wooden floor. He stopped a mere few feet from her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You can feel it now, can't you?" he murmured, his voice dropping even lower, barely more than a whisper. "The house is awake." Evelyn wanted to look away. She wanted to run, to push past him and escape the suffocating grip of this place. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed as if the air itself had become too thick, too heavy to move through. "It's been waiting for you," Mr. Crane continued, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Just as it waited for all the others before you, the ones who thought they could uncover its secrets." A sudden noise, like a distant muffled scream, echoed from somewhere deep inside the house. The sound was impossible to ignore, rising and falling in a haunting, undulating rhythm. Evelyn gasped, her pulse quickening as she whipped her head toward the source of the sound. "Do you hear it?" Mr. Crane's voice was colder now, his lips barely moving. "It calls to you." The whispering grew louder, drowning out everything else. It was no longer coming from the walls, it was coming from everywhere, swirling around her, tugging at her mind. "Leave, leave, leave." Evelyn's heart raced. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The air felt alive, suffocating, her pulling her deeper into the mansion's cold embrace, and then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something shift. A figure, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness, standing just beyond the reach of the candle's light. It was a woman, but not a woman in any way Evelyn understood. Her skin was pale, her eyes black, sunken into a face that was more shadow than flesh. Her lips moved, but no sound came, only a cold, mocking silence. The figure stepped forward, gliding across the room with an unnatural fluidity, its presence distorting the air, bending the shadows around it. Evelyn's breath hitched, the room tilting as she stumbled back, her body finally able to move. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I don't want this. I need to leave." Mr. Crane's smile never wavered. "Leave?" he repeated softly. "It's too late for that. You are part of the house now, Evelyn. You always have been." The figure in the shadows reached for her, its fingers stretching impossibly long, its touch cold as death itself. The closer it came, the more Evelyn felt her strength drain away, like the life was being pulled from her very veins. "It's not your fault," Mr. Crane said. "You didn't know what you were walking into, but you can't escape it now." As the figure's hand reached for her throat, Evelyn's vision blurred and she screamed, though the sound didn't come from her. It came from somewhere much deeper, from the very house itself. The walls trembled, the shadows closed in. The figure's fingers brushed against Evelyn's neck, cold as ice, sending a shock through her spine. The touch was so soft, so gentle, but it was wrong, so wrong. It wasn't a hand, not really. It was more like a shadow made of some unfathomable substance, a dark fluid that moved against her skin like liquid fear. Evelyn gasped, choking on the air that had suddenly turned thick, suffocating. Her heart thundered in her chest, a deafening beat that seemed to echo through the very walls of the mansion. She tried to pull away, to push the figure off, but her limbs were heavy, her body frozen in place. The figure's face was obscured, but Evelyn could feel its presence all around her, its malice, its hunger. It was drawn to her, as if it had been waiting for her, watching her, calling her to this moment. Its touch tightened, an unbearable pressure that threatened to crush her throat. The whispering grew louder. "Leave, leave. You shouldn't have come." It was the house, the walls. They were speaking to her, each word thick with malice, each syllable pulling her deeper into the darkness. The whispers filled her mind, crawling under her skin, wrapping around her thoughts until she couldn't tell where the house ended and her own fears began. And then, as if the mansion itself had heard her struggle, the figure abruptly withdrew. It didn't vanish. It simply stepped back into the shadows like a trick of the light that was no longer there. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her throat raw. The sensation of its touch lingered, cold and clammy, as though it had left an imprint on her very soul. She crawled away from the spot, her hands shaking, her body trembling as though the air itself had turned to ice. But the room wasn't still. The walls, those towering ancient walls, seemed to shift. The shadows warped, flickering like broken reflections in a mirror. The house was alive, breathing, pulsing with a rhythm that was not of this world. She stumbled to her feet, her eyes darting around the library, looking for an escape, looking for something to explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. Only the vast, suffocating silence. Then she heard it, a soft tapping, like fingernails against wood, slow and deliberate. Evelyn spun, her heart racing in her chest as her eyes scoured the dark corners of the room. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the walls. She could feel it now. The very air seemed to vibrate with the sound, as if the house itself were trying to communicate with her. She could hear it in the floorboards, the ceiling, the windows. Every surface was alive. Every inch of this place was aware. Her mind reeled, her thoughts spiraling as the walls closed in around her. The noise grew louder, the tapping turning to scraping. She could almost hear it now, underneath the house, beneath the floor, beneath the very foundation. Her fingers shook as she reached out, pressing her palm against the cold wooden wall. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was a strange silence, a tension so thick it was suffocating. And then, scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was deafening, like nails being dragged across bone. Evelyn pulled her hand away from the wall as if it had burned her, her pulse racing with a cold terror that had taken root deep within her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she couldn't stop the tremors that racked her body. The walls groaned in response, a deep, resonating noise that vibrated through her bones. And then, as if on command, the shadows in the room began to shift, not just flickering this time, moving. They twisted, contorted into shapes that defied logic, shadows that stretched and writhed like living things, pulling and twisting, growing longer, deeper. They reached toward her, reaching for her legs, her arms, her very soul. The space itself seemed to bend, like the house was warping, reshaping to swallow her whole. Evelyn stepped back, her mind racing for an escape, but the door, the only exit, was gone. The walls had shifted, the room now an endless maze of angles and shadows, each corner concealing something unspeakable, something that had always been here, waiting. The whispers came again, louder now, filling the room. "It's too late, Evelyn. You cannot leave." The walls seemed to breathe with the sound of the voices, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that echoed her own panicked heartbeat. The house was alive. The house knew her. It had always known her. She wasn't just a visitor here. She was part of it, bound to it, wrapped in its suffocating embrace. And then from the deepest shadows something stirred. A shape, a figure. It was the same as before, the same dark, towering form, but this time there were others. Dozens of them, their forms indistinct but alive, watching, waiting, surrounding her. The shadows closed in, and Evelyn felt the weight of them, the cold, the darkness, the choking, suffocating presence that had been growing since the moment she stepped foot in the house. She backed away, her hands scrambling for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shifting walls, the scraping, the whispering, and the growing figures in the shadows. The whispers reached a crescendo, a maddening cacophony of voices, and then silence. Evelyn froze. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. The shadows hovered, waiting. She could hear her own ragged breathing, the beat of her heart in her ears, and then, finally, the voice returned. But this time, it wasn't the house. It wasn't Mr. Crane. It was her own voice echoing through the walls, calling out from the darkness, "Help me!" And the shadows closed in. The silence hung in the air like a suffocating fog, dense and unyielding. The shadows that had pressed in on Evelyn, the twisted, unblinking figures, seemed to hold their breath, their forms growing ever more defined as the seconds stretched into eternity. And yet, despite the stillness, Evelyn felt something deeper, a change. Something had shifted in the house. The darkness, once an oppressive presence, now pulsed with purpose. The walls continued to hum, their whispers now a low, constant murmur beneath the surface of her thoughts. "Help me," her voice. But the question lingered unanswered, a hollow plea that seemed to echo from every corner of the room, from the very foundation of the mansion itself. The house, the shadows, had become something more than merely haunted. They were alive. The shadows twisted and reformed before her, morphing into a shape she could almost recognize. A woman, tall, her face obscured by darkness, her form moving with unnatural grace. Her features were indistinct at first, like an unfinished painting, but with each passing moment, Evelyn could see them more clearly. The woman's eyes were hollow, black pits of despair, and her skin was pale, like something long dead and forgotten. The wry figure moved closer, step by step, its presence drawing Evelyn in. There was no escape, not anymore. Her body was rooted to the spot, unwilling and unable to turn away. The air around her seemed to thicken, pulling her in, the shadows wrapping around her like a shroud, tightening with each breath. You are the one who has been chosen." The woman's voice was soft, but carried an edge of something darker, something ancient, as if the words had been whispered by the house itself. It wasn't just the woman speaking, it was the mansion, the very presence of it. Evelyn's chest tightened, the weight of those words sinking into her bones. "Chosen?" she repeated, her voice thin and trembling. I don't understand." The figure moved even closer, and Evelyn could feel the air around her shift. It was colder now, colder than before. Her teeth began to chatter, her breath quick and shallow. "You were always meant to come here," the woman continued, her voice laced with something that sounded like familiarity. "This house, it's not just a place, it's a doorway. It was built upon the bones of the forgotten, and it claims every soul who enters. You think you're different, that you are merely a visitor?" Evelyn's pulse quickened. No. She didn't understand, couldn't understand. The whispers were building now, an all-consuming sound that distorted her thoughts, rattling through her mind like a swarm of insects. The figure, the woman, she was no longer simply a shadow. She was everything. She was the house, and the house was her. "It's too late, Evelyn. You were always meant to be here." The words hit her like a hammer, each syllable a nail driven deep into her mind. Meant to be here. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. No, she had come here seeking answers, not this. She had come to uncover history, not become part of it. But there was no escaping the truth now. The woman stepped forward, the shadows that had enveloped her now receding, and Evelyn could see her face clearly. It was not a face at all, but a mask, a veil of darkness that pulsed like living flesh. The woman's lips moved, but instead of words, a sound like dry, cracking earth escaped, a low, guttural hiss that reverberated through the walls. Suddenly, Evelyn's vision blurred. The room around her twisted and contorted, the walls pulling inward, pressing in on her, suffocating her. The shadows surged toward her like an unstoppable wave, and she could feel them, cold and grasping, dragging her down, pulling her into the heart of the house. "You cannot fight it," The woman whispered, her voice dripping with cold certainty. "You are already here. You have always been here." The mansion shook, the walls groaning as though they were alive, bending to the will of the darkness that now filled the room. Evelyn's body felt heavy, her limbs numb as the shadows closed around her like an iron cage. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the woman's hollow eyes, gazing at her with a knowing, pitying look, as though the figure had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to finally understand the truth of it all. The mansion wasn't a prison. It was a legacy. The souls who entered its walls were never meant to leave. They were not merely trapped. They were absorbed, taken into the house, part of its endless, hungry cycle. Evelyn had not been invited to uncover its secrets. She had been chosen to become one of them, a part of the house, forever. And then, the last whisper of the mansion echoed through her mind, a cold, final breath in the still, suffocating darkness. Welcome home. The mansion fell silent once. Again, its secrets once more buried deep within the walls, waiting for the next soul to enter. Evelyn's mind snapped back into focus with a jolt, though she couldn't tell whether she was awake or still drowning in the suffocating depths of the mansion's grip. Her body felt heavier, as though the very air around her had solidified, turned to lead. The dark woman, the shadows, the walls, it all blurred together, pulling her under with a force she couldn't resist. And then, suddenly, she was alone again. The oppressive weight of the house shifted, but it didn't lift. It pressed tighter, enclosing around her, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Her hands trembled as she reached for her throat, as if trying to remove the cold sensation that clung to her skin, but her fingers found no relief. There was no escape. There was no place to run. But Evelyn could feel something new now. A presence, a watching, lingering sensation that crawled over her skin, creeping beneath her very thoughts. It wasn't the shadows this time. It wasn't the woman, or even the house. It was something else. Evelyn's eyes scanned the dark room. The shelves, once full of ancient tomes and forgotten records, now loomed as silent sentinels. The books were still there, but their titles were unreadable, the covers slick with an oily sheen. Her gaze slid from one shelf to the next, lingering in the oppressive stillness. But nothing seemed to move. And then she saw it. A reflection, but not hers. It was faint at first, just a shimmer in the corner of a dusty mirror hanging on the far wall. It wasn't a figure at all, but rather a pair of eyes, dark, vacant, and endless, staring from the shadows. Her breath caught. They were watching her. The eyes blinked. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she instinctively took a step back, her feet stumbling over the wooden floor. The eyes remained fixed on her, unmoving, their gaze cold, all-knowing. It was a presence. That couldn't be explained. Nothing human, nothing of this world, but so real that it threatened to swallow her whole. And then she saw more. It wasn't just in the mirror. The eyes were everywhere, flickering in the glass of the bookshelves, in the reflections of the windows, in the dark recesses of the room, watching, waiting. At first it was just one pair. Now there were dozens, a sea of eyes, all blinking in unison, all staring at her. She could hear the sound of their gaze, the soft, incessant hum in the back of her mind, like 1,000 whispers too soft to understand, but too loud to ignore. Her breath caught in her throat as the whispers started to form words. "You see us now. We've always been here." Evelyn's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. None of this made sense. The eyes were not just reflections, they were alive. She could feel them on her skin, crawling over her, burrowing into her thoughts. They were in her, each one a silent scream that pressed in on her, as if they were searching for something hidden within her mind. She tried to turn away, to ignore it, to force herself to walk toward the door, but her legs wouldn't move. The weight of the eyes was too great. They anchored her to the spot, drawing her deeper into their suffocating gaze. "You're not meant to leave, Evelyn." The Doa voice was not Mr. Crane's. It wasn't the woman's. It was 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, all speaking at once, all coming from the eyes. She could feel them, whispering from every direction, their intentions clear, their message undeniable. "You are one of us now. You belong to the house." Her hands shot up to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was everywhere. Every thought, every breath, every second was consumed by the relentless watching. The air felt thick with their presence, each moment stretching into eternity. The eyes knew her, knew everything about her, her fears, her regrets, her darkest memories. It was as though they had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. In the corner of her vision, something shifted. A figure, slender and dark, its form indistinct at first. But then, it was the woman again, the one from the shadows. She was standing just behind the mirrors, her face obscured by the reflection. "Look at me." The woman's voice echoed through the walls, her voice like cold metal on skin. "You've seen the eyes, you've seen the truth. It's too late to turn away." Evelyn tried to move, tried to escape, but her body refused to listen. The house had her in its grip now. The eyes followed her every movement. Each step she took only deepened the pull. She was trapped in the reflection, in the gaze of the house, the living, breathing thing that had become a part of her. And then, the eyes blinked one final time. "Welcome home, Evelyn." The house settled into silence once more, its secrets hidden deep within the walls. The eyes faded, but Evelyn could still feel them, in her mind, in her soul, in the very fabric of her being. She was no longer a visitor, she was a part of it. The oppressive silence of the library seemed to follow Evelyn as she stumbled away from the mirror. Her legs were weak beneath her, her head spinning with the residual weight of those countless eyes watching, judging, knowing. Every step felt like it took her deeper into the house, and the house was alive, its presence pressing against her, seeping into her skin, crawling into her bones. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she couldn't stay in the library, not with the memories of the eyes still burning in her mind. So, without thinking, she pushed open the nearest door, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. It opened into a long, narrow hallway, the air cool and musty. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, and the walls seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't understand. The darkness in the corners of the hallway felt deeper here, as if it was swallowing the very light. The house seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, twisting like a maze. As Evelyn walked, she noticed something strange. The hallway was lined with portraits, paintings of men and women, their faces frozen in time. They were all old, their frames gilded and weathered. But what struck her was the intensity of their eyes. Every portrait seemed to stare directly at her, their gazes following her down the hallway. She could feel the weight of each pair of eyes, like an unspoken command, an accusation. The figures in the paintings were more than just painted images. They were alive, their expressions etched with sorrow, longing, and something darker. A sense of unease crept up Evelyn's spine as she walked past them, each painted face feeling more and more familiar, like a dream she couldn't remember. The portraits were of families, generations of people who had lived in the house. Some looked noble, others poor, their clothes and hairstyles reflecting eras long past. But as Evelyn moved closer to one of the paintings, her breath caught in her throat. It was a family portrait, an older man and woman seated on an ornate chair flanked by two children. The man's face was harsh, carved with deep lines, but it was the eyes of the children that made Evelyn's blood run cold. They were familiar. She had never seen them before, but she knew those eyes, dark, hollow, void of warmth or life. It was the same feeling she had when she saw the reflection in the mirror, the same feeling of being watched. But these were real eyes, living eyes. The children stared at her, their eyes following her every movement, just as the portraits of the other people in the hallway did. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she stumbled back, her mind racing. She could hear the soft scratching beneath the floorboards again, as if something was moving just under the surface, trying to claw its way out. She glanced down at the floor but saw nothing, just the faded wood, splintered with age. But the eyes in the portraits, they were real. The children in the painting were not just staring at her, they were waiting for her. Evelyn felt the room close in on her, the air growing thick and suffocating as she stood there, locked in their gaze. They weren't just memories of the past, they were trapped here. The house had kept them, bound them to the walls, to these portraits like insects caught in amber. A strange voice echoed in her mind, distant but clear. "You've seen them, Evelyn. You've seen what they saw. They can't leave. And neither can you." Evelyn shuddered and turned away from the painting, but the hallway seemed to stretch further ahead, like an endless corridor of eyes. She moved past the portraits, her footsteps quickening, her breath shallow and erratic. The whispers, once faint, were now louder, surrounding her, growing in volume as she walked. Leave, leave, leave. It was everywhere. The walls, the paintings, the floors. All of it spoke to her now, as if the house had become a living entity, consuming everything in its path. The words in her mind seemed to twist, distorting into shapes she couldn't comprehend. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. The whispers turned to laughter. It was soft at first, barely more than a rustle in the dark, but it grew, louder, deeper, as though 1,000 voices had joined in unison. The sound was unnatural, hollow, like the laughter of something other, something ancient. And then the laughter stopped abruptly. A door appeared at the end of the hallway, an ornate wooden door that hadn't been there before. Evelyn stared at it, her heart hammering in her chest. The air around her felt cold, wrong, like the house itself was waiting for her to make a choice, to walk through that door, to face whatever lay on the other side. The portraits, the eyes, they all watched her now, their painted faces twisted in silent mockery, as if they knew what was coming. The door loomed before her, the handle cold to the touch when she grasped it. With a deep breath, she pushed it open, and beyond it, she saw the truth. Evelyn's body jerked awake, heart thundering in her chest. She gasped for air, as if the very act of breathing itself had become an effort, like the house itself had stolen the rhythm of her lungs. Sweat slicked her skin, and she shivered despite the heat of the room. The shadows in the corners of her mind seemed to still cling to her thoughts, pulling her deeper into something she couldn't escape. The room around her was still, silent, unnaturally still. The heavy air, the oppressive weight of the mansion, pressed in on her from all sides. She felt it all, its pulse, its rhythm, its quiet hunger. It was as though the house had been waiting for her to wake up, for her to become fully aware of its presence. She blinked rapidly, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light of the room. Her gaze flickered to the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the sprawling grounds outside. The wind whispered through the trees, its song mournful and ancient as if carrying the weight of centuries. It was the same cold, haunted feeling she had encountered before the eyes, before the whispers, before the portraits. The house had always been here, and so had she. Her mind reeled. Had it been a dream? Was it real? The images in her head, the eyes, the laughter, the shifting walls were so vivid, so oppressive that they felt like more than a mere dream. They felt like memories. Her own memories, though distorted, twisted into something dark and terrible. And then her body froze. A figure appeared at the foot of her bed. The woman in white. Her silhouette was barely discernible in the gloom, but Evelyn could see enough to know that this was no ordinary figure. The woman was tall, her presence impossibly thin, draped in flowing white garments that rippled like water. Her face was obscured by shadow, though Evelyn could feel her gaze, dark and suffocating, fixed on her. The woman didn't speak. She didn't need to. Evelyn could feel it in her bones, in her very soul. The woman was calling to her. Evelyn's body trembled, her limbs too heavy to move, her mind paralyzed by fear. The woman in white took a slow, measured step forward, and with it, Evelyn's heart sank into the pit of her stomach. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, the chill crawling into her skin, filling her chest with icy dread. "You know me," the woman's voice echoed in the silence, though her lips didn't move. It was soft, like a whisper, but it was everywhere. "I've been waiting for you." The voice was a deep ache in Evelyn's mind, like an echo from another lifetime, familiar but distant, like a memory she couldn't quite place. The woman reached out, her hand long and pale, but Evelyn couldn't move. The touch never came. She could feel it, feel the presence of the woman's hand, hovering just inches from her skin. Her chest tightened with terror. She wanted to scream, to fight, to get away. But the woman didn't need to touch her. Evelyn could feel the weight of her words pressing into her, seeping into her very soul. "I need you, Evelyn. I need you to remember." The cold in the room deepened. Evelyn's thoughts spun faster until they began to blur, until everything seemed to merge into one. The faces of the children from the portraits, the eyes, the whispers, the walls, all of it flooded her mind. The house, the woman, the truth. The woman's face remained obscured, hidden in the depths of shadow. But Evelyn saw something in her eyes. It wasn't the usual emptiness, the usual nothingness that consumed everything around here. No, this was something different. There was pain in those eyes, and a desperate longing. "Remember us. We are not gone. We are still here, waiting for you to join us." The room spun. The shadows began to stretch, twisting like smoke in the corners of her vision, pulling her deeper, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. The woman's face seemed to flicker in and out, shifting between the shadows and the light. Suddenly, everything stilled. The figure stepped back, fading into the darkness, leaving Evelyn breathless and trembling in her bed. The woman had vanished, but her presence lingered, heavy, suffocating, like a lingering, unspoken promise. And then, just as the room seemed to grow quieter, a sound echoed from deep within the house, a soft whispering, not in the room with her, but from the walls, from everywhere. "Remember, remember, remember." The whisper grew louder, louder still, as though the house itself was calling to her, urging her to listen, to remember, and in that moment Evelyn knew. She wasn't just a visitor here. She had been here before. The house had been waiting for her all along. The walls, the whispers, the eyes, they were all a part of her. And she was a part of them. Evelyn woke with a start, her pulse still racing, her mind tangled with the images of the woman in white, the whispering walls, and the cold weight of something ancient, pulling at her from within the mansion. The dream, or was it a vision, lingered, its grip tightening around her chest like a vice. The house hadn't just been waiting for her, it had known her. bound her to it long before she had set foot on its cursed grounds. She forced herself to stand, though her legs felt unsteady, like she was still trapped in the world of shadows and half-remembered dreams. The mansion creaked and groaned around her as though it were still alive, still moving, stretching its ancient bones in preparation for something more. Evelyn knew that she couldn't ignore it anymore. The history of this house, this place, was unraveling in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle slipping into place one by one, each truth darker than the last. She needed answers, real answers. The library, the journal she had found yesterday, hidden behind stacks of ancient tomes. She needed to look at it again. Maybe there was something she had missed. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the journal, more that it wasn't telling her. It had felt like a warning, not just a record. With trembling hands, Evelyn pushed open the door to the library. The room seemed colder now, the shadows deeper, as if the very atmosphere had grown heavier in the time she'd been away. The shelves stood like silent sentinels, their leather-bound books still waiting for her touch. But it wasn't the books that she needed. It was the journal. Her heart raced as she moved to the desk, where she had left it the night before. But when she reached the spot, the desk was bare. The journal was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She searched the shelves, frantically pulling at books, rifling through the pages, but there was no sign of it. The journal had vanished. Panic clawed at her chest. It couldn't have just disappeared. She had seen it. It had been right there. And then, as if to answer her silent question, a sound echoed through the library, a low, drawn-out groan. The walls trembled, and Evelyn turned just in time to see a door at the far end of the room open with a creak, as though the house itself were beckoning her forward. She knew she had to go. It was as if the house was forcing her down a path she didn't want to take, pushing her closer to a truth she wasn't ready to face. The door led to a narrow staircase, descending into the deepest, most forgotten part of the mansion. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she had no choice. She had to follow. The house was alive, and it had made her a part of it. There was no turning back. The staircase seemed to spiral endlessly downward, the darkness swallowing the light around her. The air grew damp, thick with mildew, and the scent of decay clung to everything. Each step she took echoed in the silence, her footsteps louder than they should have been. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for her to reach the bottom. At the bottom of the staircase, the corridor stretched before her, lined with doors that appeared just as forgotten as the ones above. The walls here were lined with old portraits, much older than any she had seen before, faces that seemed to belong to an era long past. But there was something off about them, something wrong. Evelyn walked past them, her eyes lingering on their eyes, which followed her as she moved. She felt a chill run through her as the portraits seemed to whisper, the words just out of reach of her understanding, like an old language she couldn't remember. The words felt like a warning, but what was it trying to say? She moved past the portraits, her footsteps slow but determined, until she reached the end of the hall where a heavy wooden door stood. This door felt different. It wasn't just ancient. It was alive with something, the grain of the wood shifting beneath her fingers as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small room, its walls lined with bookshelves, filled with dusty old records, but it wasn't the books that caught her attention. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate mirror, large and framed in intricately carved wood. The glass was dark, almost like a pool of ink, and as Evelyn moved closer, her reflection flickered in the surface, distorted by shadows that seemed to breathe around her. But there was something more. The mirror didn't reflect the room behind her. It reflected a different place entirely, a vast, decaying mansion. Her mansion, the very one she was standing in, but different. The walls were rotting, the windows shattered, the air thick with decay. Figures moved in the reflection. Figures. She recognized the portraits, the people from the paintings she had seen above. They were alive, but twisted, their faces distorted by agony, their eyes wide and empty, staring out at her from within the reflection. And then, something moved in the mirror, something that wasn't supposed to be there. A figure, a woman, draped in white, standing just behind Evelyn in the reflection. It was the woman in white. She had followed Evelyn into the room, just as she had followed her through the house. Her presence somehow tied to this cursed place. The woman's eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, stared at her from the reflection, her mouth slowly curving into a smile. But it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was cold. It was knowing. "You remember now, Evelyn. You always have." The words sank deep into her bones, and Evelyn knew she knew the truth. This house, these people, the woman in white, they weren't just part of the past. They were here, living in the reflection of time, trapped within the walls of the mansion, waiting for the next soul to come, to remember. Evelyn turned away from the mirror, her eyes wide with fear. But it was too late. She was already a part of it. She always had been. She was a part of the house now, woven into its fabric, its curse, its endless cycle, and the house knew her. Evelyn's heart beat wildly in her chest as she stumbled back from the mirror, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. The air around her was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that presses down on you, suffocating every thought, every breath. The woman in white still lingered in the reflection, her hollow eyes locked onto Evelyn's, her smile twisting with a dark knowing that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. "You remember now." The words echoed in Evelyn's mind, not as a whisper, but as a truth that had been buried deep within her, hidden beneath layers of forgotten time. The house had been calling her for so long, and now, at last, she understood. The walls of the room felt alive. The dark, weathered wood seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if it were breathing, expanding and contracting with every heartbeat. Evelyn could feel it in the air, in the very bones of the house. The mansion was awake, and it was listening. The walls, the floors, the shadows. They were all listening to her every move. The whispering began again. At first, it was faint, a soft murmur, like the wind moving through the cracks in the walls. But then the whispers grew louder, swirling around her, rising from the very foundation of the house. The sound was coming from everywhere, reverberating in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as if the house itself was speaking. Its voice, a chorus of voices layered upon one another, each one faint but unmistakable. Leave, leave, leave. But it wasn't a command. It wasn't an order. It was something deeper, something more primal. The house was trying to make her understand. It was trying to show her something she had forgotten. Evelyn's breath quickened as she pressed her back against the wall, the whispers growing louder, filling her mind with a dizzying pressure. She couldn't think, couldn't focus. The walls around her seemed to close in, inch by inch, suffocating her in the endless hum of sound, of voices. Her fingers shook as they dug into the wood of the wall, trying to steady herself. But the surface of the walls was soft, like flesh, warm and pulsing beneath her touch. She could feel it moving beneath her skin, twisting and shifting, as though the house were alive, its veins running through the walls themselves. "Remember us," the whispers continued, and Evelyn realized with a jolt that the voices weren't just from the house. They were hers, her own thoughts, her own memories, her own buried fears. They were the voices of the people who had lived here before her, the ones trapped in the walls, in the shadows, in the very fabric of the house itself. You can't leave. You are one of us. The words slammed into her like a physical force, and she gasped, the weight of them crushing her chest. She had always known, hadn't she? Deep down, she had always known that this house wasn't just a place. It wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was something else, something old, something ancient, something that grew with every soul it claimed. She turned, her eyes darting to the hallway beyond the room. It was darker now, the shadows stretching. Impossibly long. The air felt heavier, colder. She could hear something. Faint footsteps echoing, dragging like the sound of something or someone slowly approaching. She wasn't alone. But it wasn't just the footsteps. There were others, whispers, voices. No, screams, deep from within the walls, clawing their way into her consciousness. The house was alive with their presence, with their longing, their torment. "Why won't you leave?" the voice in the wall whispered, and Evelyn froze. It was familiar, too familiar. It was her own voice, but distorted, warped by the house's influence. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls like a chant. They were beckoning her, pulling her forward, urging her to understand. The house wanted her to remember what had been buried beneath the years, what had been erased from her mind. "It's too late for you," the voice whispered again. "You were always meant to be here. We all are." Evelyn's heart raced, and for a brief moment, she felt a crushing weight of realization. The house wasn't just trapping people. It wasn't just a prison. It was a cage for souls. Every soul that had ever entered, every soul that had belonged to this place. It was a place of endless cycles feeding on memories, on the anguish of those who had been trapped here. And she was now one of them. Her head spun as the walls groaned, the whispers intensifying like 1,000 voices wrapped in one. The house knew her. It knew her better than she knew herself. "You've been here before, Evelyn," the voice in the walls whispered again, now calm and sure. "You were one of us before, and you'll be one of us again." The shadows around her shifted, swirling into shapes, faces, hands, fingers, reaching out from the walls, from the corners, from the very air. The figures seemed to emerge from the darkness, their faces distorted, their bodies broken and twisted, but their eyes, those eyes, were the same. Hollow, empty, watching her, calling to her. And then, from the darkness beyond the shadows, something else appeared. A figure, tall, thin, dressed in tattered white, draped in a shroud of shadow. It was the woman in white, the same woman who had haunted her dreams, who had called to her from the mirror. She didn't speak, but her presence was overwhelming, like a wave crashing over Evelyn's mind. And the whispers stopped. For a brief moment, everything was still. The house held its breath. The woman in white stepped forward, her hand raised, beckoning Evelyn closer. "Remember," the woman said softly, her voice carrying an infinite weight. "You are not free. You never were." The walls trembled, the house groaning as though it were waking from a deep slumber. And then, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place, Evelyn remembered. She wasn't just a visitor. She had never been a visitor. She had always been here. The house had called her. It had been waiting for her. She was part of it now, and there was no escaping. Evelyn's world tilted, the room around her spinning in a dizzying blur of shadow and light. The woman in white, her face still hidden in the dark shroud of her hood, stepped closer, her presence heavy with an ancient inevitability. The air itself seemed to warp with her movements, as if the space between them were shrinking, bending to her will. The walls of the house groaned again, deep and sorrowful, as if echoing the agony that Evelyn could feel rising within her chest. You are not free. The words reverberated in her mind, over and over, until they became a mantra, an inescapable truth. Her hands trembled as she reached out, touching the cold, damp wall for support. It was as though the house itself were drawing her in, pulling her closer to whatever fate awaited her. The woman in white raised her hand, motioning toward the far corner of the room. Evelyn followed her gaze, her heart hammering in her chest. At first, there was nothing but shadow, an empty void where the light seemed to fade, but then movement. A shape began to form, slowly, impossibly, like smoke rising from a burning ember. It was a figure, but not a figure like any she had seen before. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching and elongating as if it were made of darkness itself. The edges of its form were jagged, like shards of black glass, constantly shifting and reforming. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a distortion, an impression of human features warped beyond recognition. Eyes, endless, hollow pits, stared at her from the center of its shadowed face, filled with an empty, ravenous hunger. The thing, no, the entity, moved toward her with a fluidity that seemed unnatural, too smooth, like liquid darkness flowing in place of flesh and bone. Evelyn felt a chill settle into her bones, cold enough to freeze her from the inside out. The shadows in the room seemed to shift in tandem with its movements, as though the very walls were bending to its will. The whispers, those same whispers that had filled the house for so long, grew louder, their words now clear, each voice distinct and impossibly old. We are the forgotten. We are the lost. We are the house. The words echoed in the room, twisting and warping around her, pulling her mind in every direction. She could feel the walls pressing in, the floor beneath her feet shifting like quicksand, as if the mansion were alive, alive with hunger. The entity stopped just in front of her, its form towering over her like a nightmare made flesh. But the woman in white remained motionless, standing in the corner, watching her with those empty, knowing eyes. The air was thick now, heavy with the presence of something far older than time itself. Evelyn's body shook, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, rooted to the spot, her breath shallow and erratic. The entity reached out, its hands long and twisted, grasping toward her. Its fingers were thin, sharp, like blackened claws, and with each movement the shadows seemed to shift around her, enclosing her in a cage of darkness. The air grew colder still. She could feel it, the pressure, the weight of the house pressing down on her, pulling at her, dragging her toward the entity. She knew, with a horrifying certainty, what it wanted. It wanted her. The house had been waiting for her, just as it had waited for all the others. And now, she was here. She was part of it. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and warp, pulling her toward the entity's outstretched hands. Its eyes, endless black pits, stared into hers, and Evelyn could feel herself falling into them, falling into the abyss. She could feel the weight of everything that had come before her. Every soul, every lost memory, every breath taken by the ones who had entered this house, never to leave. She could feel their pain, their longing, their suffering, all swirling around her. Wrapping around her like a shroud, the entity's mouth opened impossibly wide, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dark. A scream tore itself from her throat, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, disappearing into the void. And then, as if the house itself had heard her, it spoke. You are the latest, Evelyn. You are the newest thread in the tapestry. You will never leave. You will never escape. You belong to us now. The words settled over her like a weight, and Evelyn understood in that moment the terrible truth. This was not just a house. It was a prison. A prison for the lost, the forgotten, and the dead. It had been waiting for her, calling her, pulling her toward it, and now it had claimed her, just as it had claimed every soul before her. She was no longer a visitor. She was no longer a guest. She was part of it now, part of the house. The last thing she saw was the woman in white, her face finally revealed, her eyes hollow with ancient sorrow, as she stepped forward, placing a cold, bony hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "You will never be alone," she whispered. "We are all here. We are always here." And then the darkness consumed her. Evelyn didn't know how long she had been standing there, her body frozen, her mind trapped in the endless, suffocating darkness. It felt as though time had no meaning anymore, as though the house had swallowed her whole and had become her entire existence. The very air felt like it was pressing down on her chest, thick with the weight of forgotten memories, lost voices, and the lingering touch of the shadowed figures that moved just beyond her reach. But slowly, as though emerging from a dream that had never truly ended, Evelyn began to feel again. The cold was still there, so deep and suffocating that it felt like it was coursing through her veins, but there was something more, something shifting beneath the surface of her skin, something that whispered in the recesses of her mind, urging her to remember. The truth. The house had always been waiting for her. It had called to her from the moment she first received that letter, that strange invitation from a relative she had never known. She had thought it was simply an opportunity to uncover a forgotten history, to learn about the mansion and its secrets. But now she understood. She had never been meant to uncover the past. She had been chosen to become a part of it. The walls groaned again, their deep rumblings resonating in her bones. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, and she realized that she was no longer in the room with the woman in white. She wasn't standing in the hallway either. She was somewhere else, somewhere deeper within the house, somewhere darker. The air was thick with a stench of decay, and the walls around her were cracked, their surfaces stained with time's cruel touch. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, something new caught her attention, an object that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was an old, weathered book, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and fragile. It sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, almost as though it were waiting for her. The truth was buried inside that book, the last piece of the puzzle she had been desperately trying to solve. As she approached it, the whispers started again, soft, like the wind carrying the faintest echo of long-forgotten words. She reached out, her hands trembling as she picked up the book. The moment her fingers touched the cover, the whispers stopped. The house grew still, as though it was holding its breath. With a deep, reluctant breath, Evelyn opened the book. The first page was filled with scribbled notes, words written in a frantic, desperate hand. She could feel her pulse quicken as her eyes scanned the pages. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. She recognized it now, though it was so faded, so old. It was the same handwriting from the journal she had found earlier in the library. The journal that had vanished, just as she was beginning to uncover the truth. This was the journal of her ancestor, the one who had lived in the house before her, the one who had been consumed by it, and the truth was worse than she could have ever imagined. The journal spoke of the house's origins, its foundation built on an ancient burial ground, a place where rituals were performed by those who sought to transcend the bounds of mortality. The house wasn't just built on the bones of the dead, it had been formed by them. It was a structure meant to contain souls, to trap them, to feed on them, to twist them into something else entirely. The inhabitants of the house were not just people, they were sacrifices, willingly or unwillingly given to the house to fuel its unnatural power. As Evelyn turned the pages, the words became more frantic, the scrawl more disjointed. The last entry sent a cold, sickening wave through her. "They know now. They see me. I have become part of it, one of them. There is no escape. They never leave. They are waiting for me to join them, and I can feel them in the walls. They will not let me go. Not now. Not ever. Evelyn's hand trembled as she slammed the book shut, the weight of its contents pressing down on her chest. The walls around her seemed to pulse with life, each heartbeat a reminder that the house had claimed her long ago, just as it had claimed every soul before her. But the truth was even darker than that. The house had never just been waiting for her. She had been drawn to it, guided by a force she hadn't understood, a force that had been present in her blood, in her bones. She wasn't merely a visitor. She had been part of this house's legacy since the moment she was born. The house had been calling her. Her ancestor, the one who had written this journal, had known this truth, but they had tried to fight it, to escape the house's grip, and had failed. The house, with its endless, insatiable hunger, had claimed them, just as it would claim Evelyn. There was no escaping it. There never had been. Evelyn staggered back from the pedestal, her body trembling, as the realization settled over her like a wave. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. And there was no way out. The house had a purpose, and she had always been a part of it. A door appeared before her, unseen before, its outline barely visible in the dark. The house had given her an opening. She could feel the pull. The walls whispered again, their voices soft, yet insistent. Come, Evelyn. Come home. Her body moved without her consent, her feet carrying her toward the door, toward the truth that had always been waiting for her. The darkness ahead was comforting, promising her that at last she would be remembered. Not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as one of the house's own. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she stepped. Across the threshold, her fate sealed, and behind her, the whispers grew into a low, unearthly chant. You are one of us now. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped across the threshold, the heavy wooden door creaking shut behind her. The room she had entered was vast, darker than anything she had encountered in the mansion before. The air felt thick, as if the very walls were pressing in on her, trapping her in this dark, suffocating chamber. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, crawling across the floor like living creatures, their forms shifting and changing in the dim light. She wasn't alone. There was something in the room with her, not just the walls, not just the shadows. The air was charged with an energy so dense it almost vibrated. It felt like the very house was breathing, exhaling around her, as if it were alive, waiting, hungry for what it had been promised. Evelyn could feel it, the weight of the house's presence, like a living thing pressing down on her. It was in the shadows that clung to the walls, in the very floor beneath her feet, in the cold air that clung to her skin. The house had been watching her, waiting for this moment, and now it was finally complete. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Why? Why had this happened to her? Why had the house chosen her, drawing her in with its whispered promises, its illusions of answers, only to claim her as one of its own? Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the center of the room where a figure had materialized. It was her reflection. But it wasn't quite her. No, this figure was distorted, its features warped by shadows and a cold, otherworldly energy. The eyes were black, endless, hollow pits that sucked the light from the room, pulling her in, dragging her toward them with an invisible force. The figure reached out, its hand impossibly long, fingers stretched and thin like twisted branches. Evelyn's body moved involuntarily, drawn to the figure, her feet sliding across the cold floor, her legs too weak to fight the pull. She tried to stop, to push back, but it was no use. Her own reflection was pulling her in. This was the house's final trap. You can't fight it, Evelyn, the distorted figure whispered. It was her voice, but not. It was colder, harsher, like an echo from deep within the earth. You are already one of us. You were always meant to be here. This is who you are now. No, Evelyn screamed, the sound muffled, swallowed by the weight of the house. She raised her hands, fighting the pressure, pushing against the invisible force that was dragging her closer to the figure. But her arms felt like lead, each movement slow and agonizing, like she was trapped in a dream where every step was an eternity. The figure in front of her smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a cruel, mocking smile, stretched too wide, too thin. It wasn't her anymore. It wasn't her reflection. It was the house, taking form, claiming what it had always been owed, her soul. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, swelling with hunger, and the walls groaned again, deep and unsettling. The entire house was alive, feeding on her, wrapping around her, closing in. You can't escape, the figure repeated, its voice like a chant now, as if the very room was echoing with the words, "You belong to this place. You always have." But Evelyn didn't give in. Not yet. She fought harder, her body shaking, her breath ragged as she pushed back, her hands reaching for something, anything to steady herself. She felt the coldness, the suffocating weight of the house pushing down on her. But there was something else, something inside her that hadn't yet broken. The house could trap her body, could trap her soul, but it couldn't take her will. Not without a fight. The figure in front of her grew larger, the shadows swirling around it like a storm. She could feel the cold tightening around her, but she was still there. She was still fighting. "No," she whispered through gritted teeth. I won't become part of this thing. I won't become you." For a moment, there was stillness. The figure paused, as if it didn't understand, as if it had never expected this kind of resistance. The shadows around it began to shrink, the form flickering, wavering in and out of existence, and then it roared. A sound like thunder, a sound like the house itself was cracking open, splitting apart at the seams. The walls shook, the air grew colder, and the floor beneath Evelyn's feet splintered. She felt herself pulled back, her body jerked backward as if the house was trying to swallow her whole. But she fought. She pushed forward, her hands reaching for the floor, her fingers scraping at the wood, pulling herself inch by inch toward the door, toward the only thing that could save her: freedom. With a final, desperate scream, she lunged toward the doorway. Her fingers grasped the edge, and she pulled herself through, feeling the weight of the shadows trying to pull her back. But she was faster. She tore herself free. The room behind her collapsed into itself with a final bang, the echoes of the house's frustration vibrating through the walls. But Evelyn was out. She was free, or so she thought. She stood, gasping for breath in the hallway, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind a whirlwind of terror. The door behind her was solid once again, but when she looked back, she knew something was wrong. The hallway stretched endlessly before her. The mansion wasn't letting her go. It was waiting. Evelyn looked around, her pulse racing, her heart slamming against her chest. She had escaped the room. But the house was still here. It wasn't over. It wasn't ever going to be over. And behind her, from the darkness, the whispering began again. "You can't leave, Evelyn. You belong to us now." Evelyn stood in the hallway, her chest heaving, her body trembling, as she tried to steady herself against the walls that seemed to pulse with the very breath of the house. She had escaped, or so she thought. The door she had just passed through seemed to mock her, standing closed and solid in its frame, as though it had never been breached. The air felt heavy, thick, oppressive, like the house itself was breathing in time with her ragged gasps. Every inch of the mansion seemed alive, watching, waiting. It wasn't done with her. No, it couldn't be done. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the shadows stretched like dark fingers reaching for her, clawing at her legs. Leave. The whispers were soft, distant, but they were everywhere, inside her, beneath her skin. She could feel them in the pit of her stomach, gnawing at her thoughts, pulling at her resolve. She had been chosen. The house had taken her, claimed her as one of its own, and it wasn't about to let her forget. She stumbled forward, her feet dragging as if the weight of the house itself was sinking into her bones. She was tired. So tired. But she had to. Keep moving. She had to find an exit, some way to escape this nightmare that had become her reality. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, its dim light flickering like a dying flame. Every step she took seemed to bring her deeper into the house, deeper into its insatiable hunger. The portraits on the walls stared down at her, those cold, lifeless faces, their eyes following her every movement. She could feel them watching, her judging her as though they were waiting for her to break. But then something changed. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. And suddenly, at the far end of the hallway, she saw it. A door. It wasn't there before. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen it when she had passed earlier, but now it was there, beckoning her with a sickening familiarity. She walked toward it, her feet moving against her will, as if the house itself was guiding her, pulling her to this final place. The door stood at the end of the hall, solid and imposing, a stark contrast to the decaying, dilapidated nature of the house. It was beautiful, elegant even, carved wood, gilded trim, the intricate patterns of ancient symbols etched into the frame. It almost looked new, too new. Evelyn reached for the handle, her hand trembling. The moment her fingers made contact with the cool, smooth surface, a rush of cold air blasted against her face, like a wave crashing against her. The whispering intensified, drowning out everything else, its voices now clear and unmistakable. You cannot leave. You belong to us. The words were no longer a warning. They were a command. She was drawn to the door, drawn to whatever lay beyond it, even though every instinct in her screamed to turn and run. But it was too late. She was already too far in. She had already been marked, branded by the house. She opened the door, and then she saw. Beyond the door was a room unlike any other. It was vast, an infinite expanse of emptiness, a void so deep that it seemed to stretch on forever. But it wasn't empty, no. The room was filled with them, figures standing in the darkness, their forms twisted, warped, just as the woman in white had been, just as the figure in the hallway had been. These figures were no longer human. They were something else, something unnatural, made from shadows and cold, their eyes empty black pits staring into the very depths of her soul. Evelyn took a step forward, though every part of her screamed to stop, to run. She couldn't look away. The figures, those hollow, empty eyes called to her. They were waiting for her. But there, in the center of the room, stood something far worse. Something that took her breath away. A being that was neither shadow nor flesh, but something in between. It was towering, its form shifting and rippling, like liquid darkness. Its eyes, those eyes, were not empty. They were too full, too knowing, watching her with an ancient hunger. Evelyn's pulse raced, but she couldn't look away. Her body was frozen in place, her mind trapped in the pull of the entity in front of her. It was speaking, though its lips never moved, its voice resounding in her mind, deep and terrible. You came to us seeking answers, Evelyn. You wanted to know the truth, and now you see it. The walls seemed to pulse, the house itself alive, a beating heart, an ancient soul that had always been here, always waiting for her to return. Evelyn gasped, her mind unraveling as the full scope of the truth hit her like a flood. This wasn't just a house. It was a prison, but not just for the souls of those who had entered. It was a prison for everything that had ever lived, everything that had ever been. The mansion wasn't a building. It was a gate, a threshold between worlds, between the living and the dead. And Evelyn had always been part of it. She had been tied to this place since the moment she was born, woven into its very fabric, its very essence. Her ancestors, those who had lived and died here, had never left. They had been absorbed, swallowed whole by the house, just as she would be. And now, she was no longer just a visitor. She was one of them, a part of the mansion's endless, insatiable cycle. The walls of the house had claimed her, and she had become one of its many lost souls, forever trapped in the darkness that hung over it. The entity stepped forward, its form becoming clearer, its black eyes locking onto hers. "You are home now, Evelyn. You have always been." And with that, the house folded in around her, its walls, its floors, its very soul, all wrapping around her, pulling her into the depths of its cold embrace. There was no escape, no way out. She was part of it now, and the house had never let her go. The whispers, the shadows, the figures, all of them were her now, and they would always be waiting. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The air inside the house was dense, like it hadn't been properly aired in years. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, the dim light from the hallway barely penetrating the suffocating gloom. Her parents had insisted she move into the old family home after her mother's death, the house where they had grown up, where memories lingered like forgotten echoes. But something about this house, it felt wrong. She hesitated for a moment, holding her breath as the first wave of silence washed over her. The wind outside howled softly, brushing against the windows like a muted whisper, as if it knew something she didn't. She shook the thought away, trying to ground herself. It was just an old house, nothing more. Yet, the moment she stepped, inside a strange heaviness clung to her chest. The walls, cracked and peeling, seemed to loom over her, watching. She slowly closed the door behind her, the creak of the old wood vibrating through the air. The house groaned, almost in recognition of her presence. A faint whisper reached her ears, but when she turned, there was no one there. Just the hollow emptiness. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow darting at the edge of the hallway, swift and fleeting. She blinked, and it was gone. Her heart raced. "It's just your mind playing tricks," she told herself. She didn't want to believe in the stories, the ghostly tales whispered by neighbors about the house being haunted. But the chill creeping along her spine and the unsettling feeling of being watched told a different story. She took a deep breath and walked deeper into the house. The familiar scent of dust and old wood mingled with the faint, almost imperceptible scent of something metallic. It reminded her of copper, but she couldn't place it. The smell was strange, almost out of place. In the kitchen, the old clock on the wall ticked erratically, like it was struggling to keep time. Its hands were stuck, frozen at 3 o'clock, though it continued to echo its hollow beat. She wondered, briefly, if it was a broken mechanism. But the sound, how it reverberated through the house, seemed to grow louder, almost oppressive. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. The whispers began again, louder now, circling the edges of her mind. Sarah felt a prickle of dread skitter up her spine, but before she could process the sensation, the sound of the front door creaking open broke through the tension. Her pulse quickened. She spun around, expecting to find someone standing there, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence that now felt too heavy, too still. Something was wrong. Her eyes caught a glint at the far end of the hallway, a mirror reflecting only shadows. Yet the reflection seemed off. For a split second, she thought she saw a face in the glass, a pale, contorted figure staring directly at her. She blinked again, and it was gone. A cold breath hit the back of her neck. Sarah spun around, heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there, only the creaking house settling into its silence. Sarah could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, each creak and groan reverberating through the floorboards and up her spine. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since she first entered, but the air felt thicker now, more oppressive. Every breath she took was heavier, as though the very air was laced with something old, something bitter. It was more than dust and neglect. It was something worse. She forced herself to move forward, telling herself that she was overthinking it, that grief had made her too sensitive to the house's quirks. It was easy to forget how old the place was when she'd spent so many summers there as a child. Back then, it had felt like an adventure, the house standing tall on the hill like some ancient fortress, full of hidden passages, forgotten corners, and secret rooms. But now it felt like a trap, and she was caught in its web. The hallway stretched out before her like a darkened tunnel, lined with portraits of long-forgotten relatives. Their faces were painted in meticulous detail, their eyes unnervingly lifelike, following her every step as she walked past. The walls seemed to close in with each footfall, the shadows deepening around her, curling like living things that might reach out and touch her if she didn't keep moving. She walked past the staircase, its old wooden steps creaking under an invisible weight, and approached the living room. She paused for a moment at the doorway, the floor beneath her suddenly feeling unstable, as though it might give way. The air in there felt colder than the rest of the house, and the flickering light from the nearby fireplace cast long, strange shadows against the walls. The room was empty, save for a few pieces of furniture draped in dusty sheets. Her grandmother had once sat in that room, sipping her tea from an old china cup, telling Sarah stories about the house's past, stories about the land, about the people who had lived here before. She used to say the house had a memory, that it remembered every person who had ever passed through its doors. At the time, Sarah had laughed, dismissing it as an old woman's fanciful imagination, but now she wasn't so sure. Something was watching her. She turned quickly, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. But again, there was nothing, just the dim, flickering shadows cast by the fire. Her mind was playing tricks on her, she told herself. There was no one here but her. Sarah stepped into the room and moved to the center of the floor. The old rocking chair in the corner seemed to beckon her, the motion of its arms swaying gently in the draft. She frowned. The chair hadn't moved when she entered, but the soft, rhythmic rocking continued. It was as if it was trying to lull her into a sense of calm, to soothe the unease growing within her. She took another step, but her foot caught something on the floor, something hard, something small. She knelt down to find a small wooden box, its surface worn with age, almost blending in with the dark floorboards. It wasn't the type of object she would have expected to find here, tucked away beneath a forgotten piece of furniture. It was too deliberate, too out of place. Curiosity drove her to open it. The lid creaked as she lifted it, revealing a small collection of objects. Dull, rusted keys, a tarnished pocket watch, a faded photograph of a man she didn't recognize, and something else. A thin, brittle envelope, sealed shut with dark wax. Fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope, the weight of the air around her suddenly becoming unbearable. She wasn't sure why, but she knew she had to open it. It wasn't a question, more like an instinct. She slid her finger under the edge of the wax seal and carefully pulled the letter free. The handwriting was uneven, old, almost frantic in its looping strokes. Sarah's eyes scanned the words, but the further she read, the more her stomach tightened, as if something inside her was trying to stop her from understanding the message. The letter was dated nearly 50 years ago. It spoke of a family curse, of an ancient wrong that had been committed in the house, a wrong that could never be undone. The house remembers, it said. It remembers every soul that walks through its doors, and it will never let you leave. Not truly. We are bound. Here, all of us, the price of the past is paid in shadows, and they will come for you. They will come for all of us. She froze, a chill running down her spine as she stared at the last words, written with a sense of finality. There is no escape. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick and suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room moved, stretching like fingers as if reaching toward her. The rocking chair's motion had intensified, its creaking growing louder, more insistent. A soft whisper, barely audible, slid through the cracks in the walls. Sarah stood, heart pounding, the letter trembling in her hands. She needed to get out of here, to leave. But something inside her, a voice deep and persistent, kept her rooted to the spot. The house is alive, it seemed to whisper, its breath rising and falling with the wind. It knows you. It remembers you. The fire flickered violently, casting strange shadows across the room, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. She hadn't heard anyone enter the house. She was alone, wasn't she? She took a step backward, eyes scanning the empty room. The house felt colder now, darker, as if the very walls were pressing in around her. She needed to leave. She needed to... A crash. A loud, sharp sound echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone, moving in the hallway above. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was had been waiting for her to hear it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The shadows moved again, and then, with a sudden surge of panic, Sarah turned and fled from the room, her heart hammering in her chest, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She reached the stairs, her hands gripping the banister as she began to ascend. But before she could reach the top, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, pale, gaunt and unnaturally still. Her pulse skipped. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her mother, but something about her was off. The woman in the doorway smiled, a thin, eerie expression that didn't reach her eyes. Her face was too pale, her skin drawn tight over her bones, her hair dark and matted, as though it hadn't been touched in years. But it was her voice that sent a wave of terror over Sarah. Soft, distant, barely a whisper, it echoed through the house. "Sarah, you've come home." The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning impossible to decipher. Sarah's heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst. The figure in the doorway, her mother, stood motionless, her face an unsettling mask of familiarity and something darker, something that twisted at Sarah's soul. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as she backed away from the door, every instinct in her screaming to run, but she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the woman who should be, her mother. "Mom?" The word came, out in a strangled whisper, but it felt foreign on her tongue, as if she were calling out to someone she didn't know. The woman in the doorway didn't respond immediately. Instead, She tilted her head, that eerie, too-wide smile spreading across her face, and then, her voice echoed through the hall. "Why did you leave me?" The words were soft, too soft, and yet they struck Sarah like a slap. The air around her seemed to thicken, the room closing in, and her skin began to crawl. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. A part of her, a terrified part of her, wanted to run. Another part, the part that still clung to the memory of her mother's warmth, wanted to reach out and beg for answers. But how could she? This wasn't her mother. This thing couldn't be. The pale figure stepped forward, its footfalls disturbingly silent, as if it floated across the floor rather than walking. Sarah's eyes darted nervously toward the stairs, and instinct screamed for her to turn and flee, to escape, but her body betrayed her. She stood there, rooted to the floor, paralyzed by fear and confusion. "Don't you recognize me?" the voice crooned, the familiar tone warped and wrong. It was as though her mother's voice had been stretched and twisted like taffy, stretched too thin, too stretched out of shape. "I've been waiting for you, Sarah, all this time." The words pierced her thoughts like nails scraping along glass. A shiver racked her body. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat constricted. She tried to call out to the woman in front of her, but the words were lost in the empty space between them. The figure took another step forward, its hands twitching at its sides, as if uncertain of what to do with them. Her mother's eyes, if they could even be called that, seemed to flicker. One moment they were wide and glassy, the next they narrowed like a predator assessing its prey. "Mom," Sarah finally managed to rasp, her voice trembling. She swallowed, hard, fighting against the crushing weight in her chest. "What happened to you? Where are you? What are you?" The figure tilted its head again, this time with a slow, deliberate motion, as if savoring the question. It spoke then, but its voice was different, its tone colder, detached, almost mocking. "You left me," it whispered, its voice laced with something unholy. "You and your father. You abandoned me. You left me to die just like everyone else." The words struck Sarah like a physical blow, and her breath caught. The silence between them felt suffocating now, each heartbeat growing louder in her ears, pounding like a drum in the oppressive stillness. Her mother had died when Sarah was just a child, a sudden, unexplained illness that had taken her from the world. She could still remember the last time she'd seen her, weak, pale, lying in that sterile hospital bed, surrounded by the scent of antiseptic and death. But this thing in front of her couldn't be her mother. It couldn't. As if sensing Sarah's rising terror, the figure took another step toward her, and the door behind her creaked open, casting long shadows across the hallway. The temperature dropped with a violent rush, a cold so intense it stole the breath from her lungs. The warmth she had once known in the house, the warmth of home, was gone, replaced by a suffocating chill that clung to her bones. "I never wanted to be alone," the thing whispered. "I never wanted to die alone. I didn't ask for this. Its voice grew louder, more insistent, now an agonized, sorrowful wail. The words twisted and writhed in Sarah's mind, distorting into something incomprehensible. "Don't leave me!" Suddenly there was movement. The thing, her mother, whatever it was, moved faster now, its hands reaching for her. They weren't hands anymore. No, they were claws. Long, jagged fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, each one tipped with a sharp, silvery gleam. Sarah stepped back, but the hallway stretched endlessly before her. She couldn't go anywhere. The walls felt like they were closing in. The shadows twisted, reaching out for her, grasping her arms, pulling her into their depths. But just as the clawed hands were almost upon her, there was a noise, a crash, a loud bang from above. The thing halted, its hands twitching in the air, its head snapping toward the ceiling. For a moment, the silence that followed was unbearable. Then it let out a low, almost guttural hiss, like something angry and wrong. Sarah used the moment of distraction to turn, sprinting toward the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest, her legs weak with fear. She was about to race up them when she heard a voice, low and filled with panic. A voice she recognized, her father's. "Sarah, you have to leave." The shout echoed down the stairwell, filled with desperation, her breath caught in her throat. He was here. But that voice, it sounded wrong too. It didn't sound like him. It was distant, detached, as if it were coming from someone else entirely. "Sarah!" The voice called again, its tone desperate, but there was something almost pleading, like the voice of a person who knew something terrible was about to happen. Sarah's feet moved on their own, propelling her up the stairs despite the terror swirling around her. She had to find him. She had to find her father. As she reached the top of the stairs, the temperature in the house dropped further. The air grew thick with a sense of wrongness. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the whispers returned, low, haunting murmurs that sounded like they were coming from all directions. "Sarah." The voice was softer now, distant. Her father's voice, but it was accompanied by something else, something that made her skin crawl. There was a sound behind it, a low, guttural growl that made her stomach lurch. She pushed open the door to the room where the voice had come from. There was no one there. The room was empty at first glance. But as she stepped inside, she felt a rush of cold air behind her. Her pulse quickened and she turned, but no one was there. Yet there was a presence, a pressure in the air that she couldn't explain. Then she saw it, the mirror. It hung on the wall opposite the window, slightly askew. And as she stared into its reflection, she saw herself standing in the room. But behind her, standing just inches away from her, was the shadow of her mother. The pale, gaunt figure of her mother, its face twisted with rage. Before she could scream, the door slammed shut behind her. The door slammed with an unnatural force, the sound echoing through the room like a clap of thunder. Sarah jumped, her heart pounding in her chest, and spun around, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere that had settled in the room like a living thing. But as she turned, her eyes were drawn back to the mirror, where she had just seen the impossible reflection of her mother. The mirror seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the surface rippling like disturbed water, as if something beneath it was stirring. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and backed away slowly, her hands still pressed against the cold, hard surface of the door. The room seemed to stretch around her, expanding and contracting with each breath she took. Every noise, every whisper seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls, the ceiling, the very foundations of the house. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting. A soft click echoed from the far corner of the room. The air shifted, and Sarah's pulse quickened. Her eyes darted to the source of the sound, where the old wardrobe stood against the wall, its once polished wood now dull and cracked with age. The doors, which had been closed when she entered, were now slightly ajar. The voice she had heard earlier, her father's, no, not his voice, came again, distant but sharp, like the crackle of static on a radio. Sarah, she stepped toward the wardrobe, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run, but she couldn't. Her feet moved of their own accord, dragging her forward. The voice, her father's voice, pulled her in, beckoning her closer. She reached the wardrobe and hesitated, fingers trembling on the edge of the door. The shadows within seemed to pulse with life, shifting, as if something were moving in the dark, something that had been waiting for her to open the door. Open it. The voice, if it could even be called that, spoke directly into her mind. The command was so clear, so insistent, that she couldn't help but obey. She pulled the door open with a slow, creaking motion, the hinges groaning in protest. The room around her seemed to contract with the sound, and the temperature dropped further until her breath misted in the air before her. Inside the wardrobe was not the expected emptiness. No, there was something else there, something much darker. The walls of the wardrobe had been lined with old photographs, their edges frayed, their surfaces stained with time. Faces stared out at her from the dark, eyes cold and unblinking, but it was the last photograph, the one at the very back, that caught her eye. It was a picture of the house, taken from the outside. The windows were dark, as though there was no light within, but it was the sky in the background that unsettled her. The sky was thick with clouds, a deep, unnatural black, and in the distance she could see someone, standing in the doorway, a tall, slender figure with long, flowing hair, their face obscured by shadow. But what truly horrified her were the eyes, pale, hollow, empty. They seemed to be looking directly at her, staring straight into her soul. Sarah recoiled, stepping back from the photograph, but her foot caught something on the floor. She stumbled, falling backward, her hand outstretched to catch herself. Her fingers brushed against something cold and hard. She froze. Her eyes flicked down, and her breath hitched as she saw what her hand had touched. A small, polished stone. It was smooth, almost too smooth, like something carved by hands long dead. The stone was dark, an obsidian black, and as she stared at it, she felt a chill creep into her bones, deeper than the cold of the house itself. "Pick it up," the voice whispered again, not in her mind this time, but right behind her, so close she could feel the breath on her neck. She whipped around, but there was no one there, only the oppressive silence of the room. The stone, however, remained at her feet, just within reach. Against every instinct, Sarah bent down and picked it up. The moment her fingers wrapped around the stone, a rush of cold shot through her, like she had plunged her hand into ice water. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she could feel the air grow thick, suffocating. She gasped, pulling her hand back, but the stone was stuck to her palm as though it had fused with her skin. The room began to spin around her, her vision blurring, the walls closing in. The whispers rose, louder now, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible. She stumbled backward, her head spinning, and collided with the wardrobe. The impact jolted her back to reality, but the voices in her head didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more desperate. She could hear her mother's voice again, but this time it was twisted and broken, like the sound of someone drowning. "You left me. You left me. You left me." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the words, but it was no use. The air around her felt like it was pressing in from all sides, pushing her deeper into the grip of something ancient, something far older than the house itself. She tried to tear the stone from her hand, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the stone was alive, its grip tightening around her, feeding off her fear, her desperation. In the distance, she heard something else. A soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps moving in the hallway, slow, deliberate, methodical. The door at the far end of the room, the only exit, stood ajar, a sliver of light cutting through the dark. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Sarah's breath quickened. She could feel the pressure of the stone in her hand, pulsing now, as if it were alive. Suddenly, a sharp, sickening crack echoed through the room. The door slammed open, and standing in the doorway was it. The creature was tall, impossibly tall, its body stretched and warped like a distorted reflection. Its face was the worst of all. The skin was pale, stretched tight over its skull, its eyes deep, black pools of nothingness. Its mouth hung open, its lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The thing didn't move, but it didn't need to. Its presence filled the room like a shadow, casting its darkness over everything. It was watching her. It was waiting for her. The air grew heavier, the oppressive weight in the room making it harder to breathe. The whispers, now a cacophony, clawed at her ears, at her mind. They spoke of things that didn't belong in the world. They spoke of hunger, of death, of a past that would never let go. The creature took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Every step seemed to make the shadows around it grow deeper, darker. The floorboards creaked beneath its weight, but there was no sound of footsteps, no echo of its passage. Only the terrible weight of its presence. Sarah tried to move, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't run. The stone in her hand seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its dark surface absorbing the light around it. It was as if it was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each passing second. "Don't look away," the voice whispered again. This time, it wasn't a command, but a warning. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the creature in the doorway, and she could feel the weight of its gaze. It was looking into her soul, seeing the deepest parts of her guilt, her grief, her fear. It was feeding off of everything she was. And then, just as she thought she might break under the pressure of its stare, the door slammed shut behind her, and the creature vanished into the dark. The room was deathly silent. The creature, whatever it was gone, and yet its presence lingered like a stain on the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah stood frozen in place, every muscle locked in terror, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Her hand still clutched the cold stone, the weight of it growing heavier with each passing moment, as though it were trying to pull her into the darkness that had just consumed the room. For several long seconds, she simply stood there, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on the now closed door. It was absurd, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was in the room with her. Something watching, waiting. A low, guttural hum filled the silence, a sound that seemed to rise from the very floor beneath her. It was deep, vibrating in her bones, and it sent a cold shiver through her spine. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah turned her head. She had to know what was happening, what had just happened. The walls, once a safe structure, now felt alien, suffocating, like they were closing in on her. It was impossible to make sense of it all. The house had been her home once, a place of comfort, of warmth, but now it felt like something out of a nightmare. She took a step forward, her legs trembling, and the floor creaked under her weight. The stone in her hand grew colder still, and the whispering voices began again, swirling in her mind like a distant storm. She couldn't understand what they were saying, words, fragments, like the cries of 1,000 souls trapped in torment. But it didn't matter. They weren't meant to be understood. The sound of a door creaking open broke her out of her daze. It was a door at the end of the hallway, one she hadn't seen before, and it was ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill into the dark room. That same cold, suffocating chill emanated from the crack, and Sarah knew without thinking that she had to go toward it. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, but her body moved on its own, the stone in her hand pulsing with an eerie rhythm, as if calling her toward the door. The hallway beyond the door was thick with darkness, deeper than anything she had encountered in the house so far. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift as though they had a life of their own, reaching out toward her like invisible hands. Her breath hitched as she stepped forward, every instinct telling her to turn back. But she didn't. She couldn't. The door creaked closed behind her, plunging her into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint sound of her own breathing. The hallway seemed endless, winding like a maze, and every step she took made the oppressive silence grow heavier. The walls seemed to press in closer, and the air grew thick, suffocating her. The stone in her hand felt heavier now, its cold surface pulsing with an almost rhythmic thrum that matched her heartbeat. She could feel it pulling her, urging her forward. But what terrified her the most was that the deeper she walked, the more familiar everything seemed. The dark wood paneling, the worn carpet beneath her feet, the low-hanging light fixtures, flickering in and out of existence. This was the house, yes, but it wasn't, not anymore. This was something different, something older, a version of the house that had existed before her birth, before the years of dust and decay had taken their toll. As she rounded a corner, she caught sight of a door at the end of the hallway, an old wooden door with a brass handle. It was the same door from the photograph, the one she had seen earlier, the one that had appeared in the image of the house taken so many years ago. The same door her mother had once passed through. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached it, the stone in her hand now cold to the point of pain. It was as though it were alive, responding to something in the house, something waiting for her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing a room she hadn't expected to see. It wasn't a bedroom. It wasn't a living room. It was a study, a library, old and filled with dusty bookshelves that stretched up to the high ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and yellowed paper. It was as though time had stood still here, like no one had stepped foot in the room for decades. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The stone in her hand seemed to pulse with increasing intensity, almost as if it were reacting to the presence of the room, to the heavy silence that weighed down on everything around her. The bookshelves were filled with ancient tomes, their spines cracked and faded. There were no windows in the room, only a dim light emanating from the far corner, where a desk sat beneath a dusty lamp. The desk was cluttered with papers, some old and some new, as though someone had been working here recently. Sarah approached the desk cautiously, her fingers grazing over the papers. Some were written in a language she didn't recognize, the letters flowing in strange patterns that seemed to swirl and shift as her eyes scanned them. Others were familiar, letters from her father, from her mother, but they were dated long after their deaths. She could feel the bile rise in her throat as she flipped through the pages. The handwriting was hers. Her hand trembled as she reached for a particular sheet of paper, one that had fallen to the floor near the desk. It was torn at the edges, yellowed with age, but the words were clear. "The house calls to you." The words were scrawled hastily, the ink smeared in places. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she read the rest of the note. "It remembers you. It remembers what you did. You cannot escape." She gasped, the paper trembling in her hands. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, the air growing more suffocating, more oppressive. A noise, a faint creaking sound, came from the far end of the room. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, and Sarah's heart began to race once more. Something was moving, something behind her. She turned slowly, the stone still in her hand, its surface now slick with cold sweat. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, and for a moment she thought she saw something, someone, moving just out of the corner of her eye. A figure, tall, pale, gaunt. Her breath caught in her throat. The thing from earlier, the one that had stood in the doorway, the one with the hollow eyes, it was here. It was in the room with her. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming, and the room felt as though it was shrinking around her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The figure moved forward, its footsteps deliberate, slow, like it had all the time in the world. It came closer, its face still obscured in shadow, But the closer it came, the more it felt like her mother. No, not her mother. Not anymore. The house remembers. The stone in her hand pulsed again, this time with a violent surge of energy. The walls around her began to twist and bend, the bookshelves warping and melting into the floor. The figure drew closer, its face now visible. A twisted, grotesque reflection of her mother's face, pale and contorted with a terrible smile. Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. Wasn't anyone's, but it was a voice she knew well. You left me, and then the world went black. The darkness was suffocating. Sarah's body felt heavy, weighted down by something unseen, something ancient, something that had been lurking in the deep corners of the house all along. Her mind was suspended in a void, lost in a haze of nothingness. There was no light, no sound, just the weight of silence pressing against her from every direction. She didn't know how long she had been in that darkness. Hours, days. Time had no meaning here. Her limbs felt numb, as if they didn't belong to her. She could barely feel the stone anymore, though she was still clutching it, her fingers locked around it as if it had fused with her skin. She tried to let go, tried to free herself from its icy grip. But it was as though it had become part of her, a part she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. Suddenly, a sound broke through the void, a distant whispering voice, low and guttural, like the murmur of wind through the trees. But it wasn't wind. It was something else. The voice, it was calling to her. Sarah. The name echoed through her mind, reverberating in the silence like a bell tolling in a distant cathedral. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but somehow she knew it was meant for her. The darkness around her seemed to stir with the sound, as though it were alive, twisting and shifting in response. The temperature plummeted, and Sarah shuddered, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tried to speak, to ask where she was, but no words came out. The air around her was thick with something, a presence she couldn't identify but could feel pressing against her like a cold hand on her chest. The voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. Sarah, come to me. And then, without warning, the darkness fractured. A sudden burst of light cut through the emptiness, blinding her momentarily. Her body tensed, every muscle screaming in protest, but she didn't resist. The light was a lifeline, pulling her out of the suffocating void. It enveloped her, wrapping around her like a cloak, and for a moment she was weightless, suspended in a space between worlds. The ground beneath her feet solidified, and with it, a sense of reality began to return. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The light faded, leaving her in a dim, ghostly glow. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, and found herself standing in the middle of a vast, empty room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the once ornate designs faded and crumbling. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked beneath her feet, each step a reminder that she was standing in a place long forgotten, long abandoned. The room stretched out before her, filled with shadows that seemed to dance just out of the reach of the faint light. The house. It was the house, but not the house. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, with a slow rhythmic pulse that felt like a heartbeat. The shadows in the corners writhed, taking on shapes that seemed to stretch and shift like liquid. Sarah's pulse quickened. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And then she heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The echo of slow, deliberate steps moving across the floor, closing in on her from behind. She whipped around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless, shifting shadows, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Come closer. The voice was closer now. It seemed to be coming from everywhere, swirling around her like a storm. It was no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural rumble, as if it were emanating from the walls themselves. The sound reverberated in her chest, making her feel as though the very foundation of the house were shaking beneath her feet. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch toward her, curling like fingers, and the temperature dropped further until she could see her breath fog in the air. Her heart raced in her chest, pounding in time with the oppressive beat of the house. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it had been waiting for her to return. She took a step back, her eyes darting around the room, but the shadows kept moving, pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel them, like hands, brushing against her skin, like 1,000 invisible eyes watching her every move. She spun around, searching for an exit, but the door she had entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of blackness. "You cannot escape." The voice rang in her mind, low and chilling, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of it. Her knees buckled, but she forced herself to stand, gritting her teeth against the rising tide of panic. She couldn't give in. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. The stone in her hand pulsed again, sharper this time, like a warning. She looked down at it, her fingers shaking as she gripped it tighter. It was as if it were alive in a way that she couldn't understand. It was the source of everything that had happened, the key to unlocking the house's dark secrets. The E. Shadows closed in around her, wrapping her in their embrace, and the voice spoke once more, its tone cold, final. "The house remembers everything. It remembers you." Suddenly, everything shifted. The walls trembled. The floor beneath her feet cracked open with a loud snap, and the room began to collapse inward, the shadows swallowing everything in their path. Sarah screamed, her voice lost in the rising cacophony, and she stumbled backward, trying to escape the encroaching darkness. But the shadows were everywhere, suffocating her, pulling her down, and the house itself, began to scream. A violent, ear-piercing wail tore through the air, a sound of pure agony, as if the very fabric of reality were being ripped apart. The walls warped and bent, the house itself groaning under the strain, and the floor buckled beneath Sarah's feet, sending her tumbling into the darkness below. As she fell, the stone in her hand flared to life, its surface glowing with a dark, pulsating light. The shadows reached for her, clawing at her, but she was too far gone. She had already fallen past the point of no return. And then she heard it. The final, terrible truth. The house never lets go. It never forgets. The darkness consumed her, and all that remained was the sound of the house's slow, rhythmic heartbeat, echoing through the endless night. The fall seemed endless, as if the very foundations of the house had split open to swallow her whole. Sarah tumbled through the darkness, disoriented, her body weightless, as though the laws of gravity no longer applied. She couldn't see anything, hear anything, just the relentless pull of the stone in her hand, its cold surface now burning with a fierce, unnatural heat. But even as she plummeted into the abyss, there was something else, a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. It came from deep within her mind, from a place she hadn't known existed, a place filled with echoes of the past. It was her mother's voice. "Sarah, my sweet girl, you must remember." The voice was soft, like a lullaby, but it carried a weight that she couldn't escape. The sensation of falling continued, but now it felt different, like she was no longer falling through space, but through time, through memories. The house was trying to pull her into its very core, to devour her soul, and yet the whispering voice pulled her in the opposite direction, urging her to hold on to something, anything, to remember, Remember. Suddenly the darkness fractured, and Sarah was plunged into a harsh, blinding light. It stung her eyes, and she raised her arm instinctively to shield her face, but the light grew brighter, hotter, until it seemed to envelop her entirely, and then silence. When Sarah opened her eyes, the world around her had shifted. The light had faded, replaced by an eerie twilight glow. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and mildew, the faintest trace of decay. She was standing in what looked like a long forgotten part of the house, an underground cellar, but different from the ones she remembered. The walls were damp with age, the stone bricks slick with moisture. Shelves lined the walls, their surfaces piled high with strange, dusty objects. Old books, rusted tools, and jars filled with things she dared not look at too closely. There was a low, rhythmic thumping in the air, like the beating of a distant heart. It came from somewhere deep within the earth, but Sarah couldn't tell where exactly. The house remembers. The voice returned, the words now a constant hum in the back of her mind. It was like a mantra, repeating over and over, drilling into her thoughts, reminding her of the house's hunger. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that the very walls around her were alive, that the house itself was watching her every move. The cellar was alive, breathing, pulsing. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, behind a dust-covered curtain, stood a door, a wooden door, aged and cracked with the passage of time. It looked ordinary enough, but there was something about it that drew her in, a magnetic force that she couldn't resist. The stone in her hand pulsed again, this time with a violent electric thrum that sent a jolt through her entire body. She could feel it. The house was calling her to the door. Without thinking, Sarah moved forward, her feet heavy on the ground, as though the cellar itself were resisting her progress. The thumping grew louder as she approached the door, and her breath quickened. "Open it," the voice whispered. "Open the door, and you will understand." The door seemed to call to her with an intensity that shook her to the core. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. But before she could grasp it, the air around her grew cold. A sharp gust of wind swept through the cellar, sending the curtains fluttering. And for the briefest moment, Sarah thought she saw a shadow, an outline, standing just beyond the door. But the shadow was wrong. It was twisted, malformed, as if it were only half there, like a reflection in a broken mirror. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she fought the instinct to turn and flee. But the pull of the door was too strong. She gripped the handle and twisted it, the old wood groaning in protest, but it gave way, opening slowly, reluctantly. Beyond the door, there was only darkness, a void that stretched far beyond the cellar, a place where light seemed to vanish into nothingness. Sarah stepped through the threshold, her feet sinking into the cold, wet ground, as if the earth itself were swallowing her. She felt a sharp sting in her lungs as she inhaled the stagnant air, the scent of rot and decay. The darkness was almost oppressive, as though it could crush her with its weight. But she had to move forward. She had to understand. The stone in her hand thrummed again, now vibrating with such intensity that she felt it in her very bones. And then, just as she thought she might collapse from the pressure, the darkness parted like a curtain, revealing a scene so surreal that it stopped her in her tracks. She was back in the house, but it wasn't the house she had known. The walls were cracked, as though the building itself had been torn apart and reassembled in haste. The floor was uneven, covered in dust and debris. Furniture was overturned, as if a great force had thrown everything aside. And in the center of the room, there, it was, the thing that had haunted her dreams, the thing that had followed her through every room of the house. It was the creature. Its form was blurry, shifting, constantly changing as though it were made of smoke or shadow. It was both everywhere and nowhere at once, its shape constantly warping, stretching, pulling itself apart and putting itself back together in a grotesque dance. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a jumbled mass of eyes, mouths, and twisted features. But the most terrifying part was its gaze. It was looking directly at her. "You've come back," it whispered, the voice coming from every direction, at once, vibrating through her very soul. "You cannot run from me. You cannot run from the house." Sarah froze, every inch of her being screaming for her to turn and run, but she was paralyzed. The creature moved closer, its form shifting as it reached toward her, the darkness around it twisting and warping with its every movement. "The house has always known you," it continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "The house remembers every step you've ever taken, every choice you've ever made. And now, it wants you back." Sarah's grip on the stone tightened until her fingers went numb, but it did nothing to quell the surge of terror that ripped through her. She wanted to scream, to flee, but something held her in place. The house, the stone, the memories, they all locked her in this place, in this moment. "The price is paid in shadows," the creature whispered. "And you are the last payment." Before Sarah could process what it meant, the creature lunged, its form contorting and stretching until it was nothing more than a blur of darkness. It enveloped her and everything went cold. Her vision blackened, the stone burning in her hand, and then nothing. The cold suffocated her, as though she were submerged in an ocean of ice, her body caught in the grasp of something far more powerful than her. She couldn't feel the stone in her hand anymore, but its presence lingered like an anchor, tying her to something unknown. The darkness swallowed her whole, pushing her further into the void, deeper than she had ever been before. Her lungs burned with the need to breathe, but no air filled her chest. No matter how hard she tried to inhale, her body seemed to be rejecting it, drowning in the deep, pressing silence. But there was something else, something more terrifying than the suffocating darkness itself. It was the feeling of falling, of being pulled deeper and deeper into the blackness, as though her very soul were being dragged into an eternal pit. She tried to move, tried to scream, but nothing came. Her body was paralyzed, suspended in this place that wasn't quite the house, but wasn't quite not the house either. It was as though reality itself had been twisted, distorted by the force that had consumed her. And then, just as she thought she might lose herself entirely, a faint glow pierced the void. It was soft at first, a mere sliver of light, but it grew, pulling her forward with an unseen force. It was like a lifeline, fragile but persistent, as if it were calling her back to something familiar. Her mind screamed at her to stay, to resist whatever force was pulling her, but her body moved of its own accord. She was drawn to the light, compelled to follow it, even though every instinct screamed against it. The glow became more intense, brighter, until it seemed to fill the void entirely. It was warm, the first warmth she had felt since she fell, and with it came a strange sense of calm. The thumping heartbeat of the house had ceased, replaced by a soft hum, like a lullaby, gentle but insistent, calling her home. Home. The word echoed through her mind, and for a moment she thought she might be able to remember something, something important, something she had lost. Her memory was hazy, like a fog had descended over it. But as she reached toward the light, fragments began to surface. Faint whispers, familiar faces, the feeling of someone holding her hand, guiding her through the house, telling her stories of things she didn't quite understand. Her mother. Remember. The voice was her mother's again, soft and maternal, but it was distant, as though it were coming from a far-off place. The light pulled her forward, and she could feel her body responding, her muscles aching with the effort to move. Each step brought her closer to the source of the glow, each step filled with the unspoken promise of an answer, of understanding. The light shimmered before her, shifting like water, and then it broke. The last barrier between her and the unknown shattered, and she was plunged into a world that was both familiar and alien at the same time. She was in the house, but it wasn't the house she remembered. It was wrong. The walls were different, darker. The rooms were colder, more cavernous. The air hung heavy with dust and the scent of something ancient, forgotten. There was no warmth here, no laughter, no sound, but the hollow echoes of her footsteps. The house was silent in a way that felt unnatural, like a place long abandoned, left to rot in its own memories. Sarah's heart clenched, her pulse quickening as she began to walk. She recognized the hallway, the familiar arches, the faint smell of old wood. But something was off. The walls seemed to move around her, shifting imperceptibly, bending in on themselves like the house was trying to keep her inside. She could hear the soft scraping of nails against the floor, the sound of something, or someone, dragging itself through the house, the sound of waiting. Her gaze darted down the hallway, but there was no one there, only the heavy shadows creeping and stretching, clinging to the corners of the walls. And yet, she could feel them, could sense their presence lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. Sarah. The voice called her name, soft and haunting, echoing in the empty hallway. It was her mother's voice again, but this time it was broken, strained. It was as if the house itself had taken her mother's voice, twisted it, and turned it against her. She turned sharply, looking toward the source of the sound, but again there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse with life, like the very walls of the house were alive, aware of her every movement. "Come to me, Sarah," the voice whispered, and this time it was not her mother. The voice was different, lower, more distorted, like the sound of something decaying, something dying. "Come and understand." The words chilled her to the bone. She couldn't tell if the voice was hers, or if it was coming from something else, something ancient, something that had always been here, buried beneath the weight of the house's memories. The shadows closed in around her, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating her with their weight. She had no choice. She had to follow the voice. She had to understand. With each step, the house seemed to shift, twisting and warping, reshaping itself to trap her. The hallway stretched longer and longer, and no matter how far she walked, it never seemed to end. The stone in her hand pulsed with a sickening rhythm, matching the beat of her heart. Her fingers were numb from gripping it, but she couldn't let go. The stone was a part of her now as much as the house was. They were tied together, bound by something older than time itself. Ahead, the shadows began to form, twisting together to create a shape, a figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, indistinct, but it grew clearer with each step she took. The figure was tall, its body stretched and hunched, limbs twisted like branches reaching toward her. Its face was obscured, but she could feel its eyes on her. Hollow eyes, dark and empty, that seemed to pierce her very soul. The voice spoke. "Again, you can never leave, Sarah." The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate, and as it did, the house seemed to groan in protest, the walls cracking and shifting. The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled and she staggered, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the wall. But it was no use. The house was pulling her into its depths, into its heart. And then the figure reached out, its hand, or what passed for a hand, closing around her wrist with a grip so cold, so powerful, that Sarah gasped. The darkness swallowed her vision, and everything went black. "You belong to us, Sarah," the voice whispered, its final words a lullaby that she couldn't escape. And then, nothing. When Sarah's eyes opened again, She was no longer in the house she had once known, the house of her childhood memories, the house where she had been loved and protected. It was a house of memory now, twisted and warped by something that had far outlasted the warmth of her family, the softness of laughter, the familiarity of simple life. This place was suffocating. The walls were dripping with a black, oily substance that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, as if the house itself were breathing, hungry for more. She gasped as the air rushed back into her lungs, but it was thick with decay, heavy and wet, like drowning in a pit of rot. Her chest tightened painfully, and she struggled to inhale, but the air tasted of mold and something far worse, something ancient. The stone in her hand had grown cold again, but the cold was not like the chill of a winter night. It was the cold of death, of something frozen beneath the earth for centuries. Sarah's fingers tingled, numb from the stone's grasp, yet she couldn't bring herself to release it. It was part of her now, a part of something much older than herself, older than her mother, older than the house itself. She blinked rapidly, her eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering light that seemed to pulse from the walls. The shadows around her danced erratically, as though the house itself were alive, writhing, shifting in ways that defied logic, as if reality itself were fraying at the edges. Every step she took made the shadows deepen, closing in tighter, pulling her in like an invisible force, urging her forward. She tried to move, but her legs were heavy, as though the very ground beneath her was made of lead. She dragged herself forward, her breath shallow, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. A sound echoed through the hallway, a low, guttural hum, like the distant growl of some beast, something ancient that had been waiting for centuries to awaken. "Sarah," the voice came again, soft at first, but growing louder, deeper, more insistent. Her mother's voice. No, it wasn't her mother, not anymore. The voice called her name again, but this time it was different. It was distorted, jagged, like something being torn apart. It was the house, the heart of the house, trying to take her, trying to pull her into itself, to feed on her soul. The stone pulsed in her hand, the vibrations running up her arm, into her chest, and she gasped as an overwhelming pressure built behind her eyes. It was as if the house were inside her mind, burrowing deep into her thoughts, into the very marrow of her bones. It had been waiting for her. The house had been waiting for her. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, but it wasn't the face she remembered. It was hollow, sunken, her eyes black holes that stared into the very depths of her soul. A grotesque parody of the woman who had once held her and kissed her goodnight. "Come to me, Sarah." The voice beckoned again, its tone a twisted, cruel mockery of everything she had ever known. It wasn't her mother. It was the thing inside the house, the thing that had fed on her family's pain, their loss, their fear, the thing that had infected everything, turning her memories into something terrible, something unrecognizable. The house had claimed her mother's voice as its own. It had claimed everything. She reached for the walls, her fingers brushing against the wet, sticky surface. The feeling was like touching flesh, warm, pulsing flesh, the very skin of the house itself. It trembled beneath her touch, as if it were alive, as if it could feel her. "You cannot leave," the voice snarled, now close enough to touch her skin, its tone shifting into something low, a rumble that vibrated in her chest. It was close, so close, her breath came out in shallow, desperate gasps as her pulse raced. It was trying to consume her, to force her into its depths. Sarah could feel it, the hunger. It was suffocating, pressing in on her from every side. The house was trying to drag her into itself, to swallow her whole and take away the last remnants of her humanity. Her throat tightened with panic as she stumbled backward, her heart pounding. but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt as though she was sinking into the ground, the very earth beneath her giving way. But then something changed. The shadows began to retreat, slithering back into the corners of the room, dissipating like smoke, leaving only the faintest echo of their presence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Was it over? She turned quickly, scanning the room around her, but it was silent. The hum that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a suffocating quiet that threatened to crush her spirit. The walls seemed to breathe still, the dark cracks running through them like veins, but they had stopped pulsing. She was alone, and yet she wasn't. The stone in her hand pulsed again, and this time the light emanating from it was not the faint flicker of before. It was sharp, bright, painful, a light that cut through the darkness, blinding her. She had to shield her eyes, but the stone's light only grew stronger, forcing her to look directly at it. The house screamed. It wasn't a physical scream, not one that could be heard with the ears. It was a scream that reverberated in her mind, a soul-rending wail that tore through her very being. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath her cracked, opening wide into a deep, inky chasm. The shadows reached up from the abyss, stretching, their long, twisted fingers toward her. But then, amidst the chaos, she saw it. In the center of the room, there was a door. It wasn't like the others, old and cracked and warped, but new. A doorway of light, faint but beckoning. It pulsed with a soft, radiant glow that contrasted sharply with the darkness around her. She didn't know where it would lead, but it was the only chance she had. "Leave," the voice whispered one final time. Now nothing more than a breath in her ear, like the fading remnants of a nightmare. Sarah didn't wait. She ran. Her legs screamed in protest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she ran. The shadows were closing in, reaching for her ankles, her legs pulling her back, but she pushed forward. She couldn't stop now. She had to reach the door. The stone in her hand flared again, its power surging through her, pushing her forward. The door was within reach. She stumbled toward it, her body racked with exhaustion, the weight of everything, threatening to crush her. But she reached it, her hand outstretched, trembling as she grasped the handle. The moment her fingers made contact with the cool metal, the world around her seemed to collapse. The darkness was no longer pressing on her. The pull of the house had stopped. She was free. With one final push, she threw open the door. Beyond, it was light, a blinding, pure light that washed over her, filling every corner of her being. Her mind exploded with clarity, with peace, and she stepped into it, finally, gratefully, leaving the horrors of the house behind. And then she was gone. Sarah's vision swam with light, blinding and pure, as though she had been pulled from the depths of an abyss and into the brilliant expanse of a new world. She could feel the warmth of the light surrounding her, filling every crevice of her being. And for a moment, she thought, no, she knew, that she was safe. Her body relaxed, and the crushing weight that had pressed down on her for so long seemed to lift, as if the universe itself were exhaling a breath it had been holding for too long. Her lungs filled with air again, air that didn't taste of dust and decay. It was fresh, clean, alive. She took a deep, steadying breath, savoring it, the air rushing through her chest like a river, sweeping away the last remnants of her fear. Her fingers, still clutching the stone, had gone numb, but it no longer pulsed with that unnatural cold. It was simply a stone, ordinary, still. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her head, to make sense of what had just happened. What was this place? What had she stepped into? The world around her was quiet now, a serene calm that she hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. She could hear the distant rustling of leaves, the soft chirping of birds, and the faint hum of the wind. For a moment she thought she might be in a meadow or a forest, somewhere untouched by the madness of the house, untouched by its malevolent presence. The air was warm, and though she couldn't see the sun, there was a golden haze on the horizon that hinted at its presence. Everything felt right, natural, but as her eyes adjusted to the light, she saw it. In the distance, it was a figure, a shadow, standing just beyond the light, framed by the golden haze. At first, she thought it was a trick of the mind, an illusion, an artifact of her exhaustion and the chaos that had followed her, but the figure didn't fade. It remained motionless, like it was waiting for her. She stepped forward, her legs moving on their own, her feet sinking into soft grass. It felt strange to be walking again, her body no longer weighed down by the oppressive air of the house. It felt like freedom, like a promise that things could be different now. The figure didn't move as she approached, and for a moment Sarah hesitated. But then it shifted slightly, just enough to let her know it was aware of her presence. Her heart stuttered in her chest. She recognized the figure, or at least she should have. It was her mother, but not her mother, not the one she remembered. This version of her mother was different, hazy, blurred around the edges as though she were a memory fading into the past. Her mother's face was soft, peaceful, and her eyes were no longer hollow, no longer blackened with the weight of whatever curse had taken hold of her. "Mom?" Sarah whispered, the word trembling in her throat. The figure remained, silent, but the air around her mother seemed to shimmer with some kind of energy. Sarah took another step forward, and the closer she got, the more the edges of her mother's form seemed to fade, like smoke drifting into the air. "Mom, where am I? What is this place?" Sarah's voice cracked with uncertainty, the weight of her confusion building. She didn't know what was real anymore, what had been the dream and what had been the nightmare. Was the house truly gone? Had she escaped? Or had she simply fallen deeper into some other form of hell? Her mother's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, there was a sense of calm, a quiet understanding, like a presence that transcended speech. And then, the figure took a step forward, slowly, deliberately, until it was right in front of Sarah. She reached out instinctively, but her hand passed straight through her mother, as though she were no more than a wisp of smoke, fading with the wind. "No," Sarah breathed, her hand falling to her side. The warmth she had felt before began to fade as the figure began to dissipate, its edges turning into mist, scattering into the air. "No, please," but it was gone. Her mother, the one she had so desperately hoped to find in this place, had disappeared, leaving only a faint, lingering scent of lavender, the fragrance of old memories trailing in the air. "You never left," a voice whispered, echoing softly from the depths of the fading mist. Sarah whipped around, heart racing, and her eyes darted across the empty meadow, but there was no one else. Just the sound of the wind whispering through the trees, like a distant memory, like a dream fading into the night. She staggered back, her mind racing to make sense of the words. The voice wasn't her mother's. It wasn't the creature from the house either. It was something else, something older, deeper. A voice that seemed to know her entirely. The ground beneath her feet trembled as if in response, and the air grew thick again, the warmth leaving her body. The golden haze that had once filled the horizon began to waver and darken, shifting into a shadow that loomed over her. She gasped, a surge of panic rising in her chest. No, she couldn't go back there. She had escaped. But the ground trembled again, this time violently, and the shadows in the distance shifted. From the darkness, she saw it. The house. But not the house she had escaped, not the decaying, dark thing that had consumed her. This house was pristine, untouched. bathed in golden light, yet still wrong in its very essence. "It's waiting for you," the voice whispered again. "It remembers you, Sarah." The earth shifted, the grass beneath her feet beginning to crack and peel away, revealing a dark, gaping maw beneath. The walls of the house, now standing in full imposing form in the distance, seemed to loom closer, its dark windows staring at her, pulling her in, calling her back. She spun away from it, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no escape. The voice, the darkness, the house, it all pulled at her, tugging at the very fabric of her being. It was inevitable. The pull of the house, the weight of its memory, had never left her. The ground gave way beneath her, and she was falling once more into the depths, back into the place where everything had started. She couldn't breathe, couldn't see. It was as though she were falling into the very heart of the house, back into the place where the shadows had first claimed her, where the walls had first closed in. But even as she fell, something began to change. A faint glow appeared beneath her, faint at first and then brighter until it enveloped her entirely. The house, the place that had taken her mother, taken everything, began to recede, breaking apart, crumbling at the edges, the darkness unraveling in on itself. The stone in her hand had turned to dust, the last piece of the house's curse, disintegrating into the air. She hit the ground soft and untouched, and the darkness disappeared entirely, leaving only the quiet peace of the meadow around her. And in that silence, the house finally let go. The silence was overwhelming. The world around Sarah seemed to stretch into infinity, the vast expanse of the meadow filled with a tranquility she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. The ground beneath her was soft, yielding, as though it had welcomed her return. Her fingers trembled as they ran through the grass, the cool blades brushing against her skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension she had carried for so long. But it wasn't just the peace that had settled. Over the land, it was the absence of the house, the absence of the suffocating grip it had had on her soul, on her every waking thought. The pull of its hunger, its dark, insatiable appetite for memory and fear, had vanished. Gone was the oppressive weight that had threatened to crush her under its terrible might. The darkness that had once lurked in every corner had fled, leaving only an empty space, a space that seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for her. Sarah drew in a slow, deep breath. She could taste the air now, fresh and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth, sweet and untainted. She had escaped. She had left the house behind, and for the first time in what felt like years, she was free. But am I truly free? The thought crept in unexpectedly, like a shadow in the corner of her mind, and she hesitated. The wind that had been gently rustling, the leaves of the trees had stopped, and in that stillness, her thoughts seemed to echo louder, more forcefully. She glanced around the meadow. It was perfect, too perfect. The golden light on the horizon, the warmth that surrounded her. It all felt too still, too peaceful. There was something about it that unsettled her, something just beyond the reach of her understanding. Her escape had been too clean, too easy. She hadn't fought her way out. She hadn't earned her freedom. Had she? A sudden, sharp pain flared in her chest. She gasped, clutching her ribcage, as though something were trying to tear its way out of her. Her heart thudded loudly, too loudly, in her ears. The stone that had once pulsed with an otherworldly power, the stone that she had thought was destroyed, reappeared. In her hand, or rather, it never left. She could feel it now, its weight once more familiar, cold and heavy against her palm. No. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ignore the stone's pull, but it was impossible. The air around her thickened, the peaceful meadow dissolving into a blur of distortion. The edges of reality began to bend, warping in impossible ways, and she stumbled backward, a scream rising in her throat. The very earth trembled beneath her, and the sky above seemed to darken, the golden light fading into an unnatural twilight. The peaceful winds turned into howling gusts, and the ground cracked, splitting open as though it had been hollowed out from beneath. The meadow she had thought was a sanctuary was no more. It was the house. The house was inside her. Her stomach lurched, and she stumbled forward, almost falling to her knees as the realization hit her. She wasn't free. She had never been free. She had merely escaped into another version of the house, a reflection, a fragment, a place birthed from the house's insidious power, its ability to warp reality and memory. It had followed her. It always followed her. The stone in her hand flared, its icy tendrils wrapping around her wrist, forcing her to look down. It pulsed with dark energy, the lines along its surface glowing a deep, menacing red. And in the center of it, where she had once seen a faint mark, an imprint of some forgotten design, there was now a symbol, a doorway. The stone wasn't a relic of the house. It was its heart, its key, its final way of pulling her back in. The door she thought she had escaped from, the one that would never let go. The ground beneath her cracked open, the earth splitting like an open wound, revealing a deep chasm filled with swirling darkness. The stone was pulling her closer, forcing her to step forward, to descend into that abyss. But she couldn't move. She wanted to run, to break free, but her body was frozen, locked in place by the stone's malevolent force. And then, in the distance, she saw it. The door. The doorway from the vision. The one she had been drawn to before, the one that had called her home. But now it was different. The light was gone, replaced by an endless, suffocating darkness. The house stood before her again, not as a distant shadow, but looming, suffocating, like a tomb that had risen from the depths of the earth. She couldn't escape it. Not now. And then the voice returned. You cannot escape. You never will. It was not her mother's voice this time. It was the house itself. The thing that had devoured so many before her, the thing that had twisted her memories, her life, into its own distorted reflection. The house that had broken her family, her mind. And now, it was here to claim her once more. You have always been ours, Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the walls of the house closing in, its oppressive weight surrounding her, squeezing her chest. The shadows from within the depths of the chasm rose toward her, tendrils of darkness reaching for her body, pulling her toward the void. But somewhere deep within her, something stirred. The light. She could feel it, faint but steady, pulsing from within her, from the very core of her being. The warmth of the golden light was still there, buried deep beneath the surface of the shadows. It hadn't left. She had carried it with her all along. This is my fight. The stone in her hand trembled, vibrating violently as if it were torn between two opposing forces, the darkness that sought to swallow her and the light that sought to heal her. She gripped it tighter, feeling the surge of energy run through her like electricity, until her very bones hummed with it. The house, the shadows, the hunger, could not hold her any longer. She closed her eyes, focusing on the light within, and let it flood her mind, her body, her soul. She felt the warmth spread outward, filling the darkness, pushing it back, erasing the walls that had once imprisoned her. With one final cry, she threw the stone toward the house. The explosion of light that followed was blinding. The ground cracked open, the house shuddered and groaned, and for a moment the world itself seemed to collapse in on itself. The stone shattered in midair, sending fragments of light and shadow spiraling into the void. And then, silence. The chasm was gone. The house was gone. The darkness had disappeared. Sarah stood in the empty space, her breath heavy, her body trembling from the energy that had just surged through her. She looked around, the once oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time she saw the world clearly. It was a world without the house, a world without the shadow. She had finally escaped. And as the last remnants of the darkness faded away, a soft voice, faint but familiar, whispered in her ear, "Well done, my dear." She turned, but there was no one there, and this time she didn't have to look back. The silence stretched on, heavy but calming, as though the very air had exhaled with her. Sarah stood alone, feeling the faintest ripple of energy still humming through her veins, like the echo of a distant thunderstorm. Her heart was slowing, the pounding of it in her chest now softer, less frantic, as she adjusted to the quiet that surrounded her. The ground beneath her feet felt solid and true, not the warped, crumbling earth she had left behind in the house. This, whatever this place was real. It was pure, untouched. It was freedom. And yet, despite the peace settling around her, despite the absence of the house that had haunted her every step, there was still a feeling deep inside that something was missing. Something was unfinished. She looked around, taking in the world that surrounded her. The landscape was vast, beautiful yet desolate. It was an open plain, the kind of place where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly, meeting the horizon in a way that made her feel both impossibly small and impossibly free. The air smelled fresh, crisp, but faintly of something else. Something old, something ancient. It was like a dream. She stepped forward, her legs shaky but determined, trying to push past the lingering uncertainty in her chest. Her eyes scanned the empty expanse before her. There was no path, no direction, only the open field that stretched as far as the eye could see. In a way, it felt like an eternal waiting room, like the calm before a storm. Everything was still, but she could sense the edges of something else just out of sight. But she had to move forward. She had to. As Sarah walked, her mind replayed the final moments, the explosion of light, the shattering of the stone, the house dissolving into the nothingness that it had created around her. She had done it. She had broken free. Or had she? Was this just another illusion? A trap set by the house to keep her from truly escaping? Her breath quickened at the thought, but she forced it down. She wasn't going to give in, not now, not after everything. The further she walked, the more. She felt something else pull at her, a tug at the edges of her awareness. It was familiar, like a nagging feeling she couldn't shake. At first, she thought it was the lingering remnants of the house's hold on her. But as her feet carried her deeper into the desolate landscape, she realized what it was. She was being followed. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, and saw nothing but the endless plains behind her. No figures, no shadows. The world stretched out, vast and empty, and yet she felt it. The eyes that watched her. The presence that loomed just beyond her field of vision. It's still here. The realization hit her like a wave. The house. It had been tied to her, bound to her essence in ways she couldn't fully understand. The pull she had felt during the last moments, the way it had tried to drag her back, it wasn't just a force of memory. It was a part of her. The house had become a manifestation of her fears, her trauma, her own shattered pieces, and now that the physical house was gone, its essence, its curse, had rooted itself within her. She could feel it now. An ancient, dark energy that knew her, that had always known her. A relentless hunger that had never fully been satisfied. A thirst for control, for possession. The house had wanted to claim her, to make her a permanent fixture in its decaying walls. And even though she had broken free, she could feel its presence, the jagged edges of its spirit that clung to her, holding her in place. Her mind raced, trying to process it, trying to grasp how this could be true. She had escaped. She had destroyed the stone. The house had crumbled, shattered, turned to dust. There was no more haunting, no more pressure, no more presence. But the house had left a mark, a scar upon her soul, and now it lingered there like a phantom, a shadow that would never let go. The earth beneath her feet began to shake again, subtle at first, like a tremor in the distance, but it grew stronger, louder, and the sky above her, which had once seemed so wide and infinite, began to darken. The golden light that had bathed the world began to fade, replaced by an oppressive, unnatural twilight. The shadows stretched, creeping toward her, pulling her in. Sarah's heart raced as she looked around, panicked. She could feel the pull, the gravity of it trying to reel her back in. She was falling back into it, back into the grip of the house's memory. No, she refused to accept it. She had broken free, but she had underestimated it. The tremors beneath. Her feet grew violent now, ripping through the ground like the claws of some unseen beast. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of something closing in on her. The horizon blurred, becoming indistinct, and then the ground in front of her cracked open. It split wide, revealing the deep chasm beneath. The same chasm she had seen before. And at the edge of that chasm it appeared. A figure, familiar and terrifying. Not her mother this time, but the thing that had always been there. The true face of the house. The shadow that had whispered her name, that had twisted her memories, that had bound her to its curse. The figure loomed in the distance, its form indistinct at first, a blend of shadow and nightmare. But as it moved closer, Sarah saw its face, its true face, and it was familiar. It was her own. A twisted reflection of her face, stretched and distorted by the house's will. Her eyes were wide with fear, with an eternal sorrow, a loss that stretched beyond her understanding. The reflection of her was not just a mirror of herself. It was a monster that had been born from her very soul, a creature of her own creation, born of guilt, grief, and the terror of never truly escaping. "You can never outrun yourself," the voice said, its tone both hers and not hers. It was the house's voice now, but it was always hers at the core. It had taken her thoughts, her essence, and twisted them into a grotesque mockery. Sarah stumbled backward, shaking her head, her chest tight with panic. She had thought it was over. She had thought that if she destroyed the stone, destroyed the house, she would be free. But this was no physical structure she had been fighting. The house had always been inside her, feeding on her fear, feeding on her weakness, and now it had come to claim her. The figure of herself smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that was more a rictus of horror than anything resembling peace, and began to move toward her. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but she knew it was futile. There was no escape, not from the house, not from herself, but then something shifted inside her. A spark, a tiny glimmer of defiance, of understanding. The stone may have been shattered, the physical house may have been torn apart, but she was still here. She was still standing, still breathing. She had fought it. She had destroyed the stone, shattered its hold on her. She had the power to end this, to take control of her destiny, to release herself from the curse. The shadows rose, surrounding her like a flood, and she clenched her fists, her arms trembling with the surge of energy that ran through her. She felt the weight of it, the house, its hunger, its endless desire to control, but she refused to let it have her. Not anymore. With a cry that was both her own and not her own, she lifted her arms toward the sky, toward the fading light. She was done running. The ground beneath her feet began to crack once more. But this time it wasn't the house that was tearing it apart. This time it was her. The house had tried to claim her, to turn her into one of its broken pieces, but she wasn't a victim, not anymore. She had fought, and now she was free. The earth trembled beneath Sarah's feet, but it wasn't the violent rumbling of the house's wrath. No, this was different. This tremor came from within her, from the very core of her being. It was the pulse of power, the defiance, filling her veins like molten fire. The darkness around her seemed to recoil from that energy, as if it couldn't comprehend what was happening. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah was in control. The reflection of herself, the twisted mockery that had been birthed from the house's influence, halted, its face contorting with confusion, rage, and something else. Fear. The house had never faced defiance before. It had never encountered someone who could fight back, who could take its hold and refuse to be consumed. Sarah stood tall, her chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. She had faced the darkest depths of the house, the ghosts of her past, the broken remnants of her memories. She had seen it all. And now, here she stood, on the edge of the abyss, with the power to decide her fate. With each breath, the house tried to claw its way back into her, tried to drown her in its oppressive pull. But Sarah's mind was clear now. She understood. The house, the darkness, the endless shadows, they had always been a part of her. They were born from the pain, the grief, the guilt she had buried deep within her soul. They were the fears she had never fully confronted, the pieces of herself she had locked away and hoped would stay hidden. But they weren't gone. They were inside her. And now she could feel them, feel all of it, rising to the surface, like a tide of memories crashing against the shore. The twisted version of her that stood before her was not a monster. It was her. It was the person she had been, broken, haunted, consumed by the darkness. It was everything she had feared she would become, everything she had tried to avoid. But it wasn't her anymore. Not truly. With a deep breath, Sarah closed her eyes and embraced the surge of power within her. She felt the weight of everything she'd been carrying for so long, the memories, the regrets, the pain, and she let it all flood into her chest. The stone that had been so cold in her hand, that had been the house's last weapon to control her, cracked with a loud, deafening snap. The power inside her burned hot as she crushed it into nothing, reducing it to dust. The house's last physical form, the symbol that had kept her tethered to it, crumbled away. The shadows around her recoiled. The earth beneath her feet seemed to recoil, as if the house had just been cut off from the very foundation it had claimed. The figure of herself, the twisted reflection of the girl who had once been too afraid to confront her own demons, screeched, its form contorting as if it couldn't hold its shape any longer. It wasn't real after all. It was a manifestation, a projection. It had no power of its own, and Sarah knew this now. The air hummed with the raw, unbridled force of her will, the very fabric of the world around her bending to her determination. The figure of the house, of the twisted thing that had haunted her, shuddered, its edges flickering like a flame caught in the wind. "No more," Sarah whispered. With those two words, everything changed. The earth split open once more, but this time it wasn't a dark chasm that swallowed her. This was different. It was a door. Her door. A door she had finally created for herself. The darkness tried to swallow her, but this time, she embraced it. She let the darkness consume her, not as a victim, but as a survivor. It was her darkness, not the house's. And then, in a single moment, she was no longer standing in that place. The twisted reflection was gone. The house was gone. The weight that had been crushing her for so long had vanished, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. She opened her eyes. The world around her was different. It wasn't the bleak, distorted land she had come to know. It wasn't the suffocating nightmare she had been trapped in for so long. It was a world of light. A world where the air was crisp and clean, where the horizon stretched wide and open, untouched by the grip of the house. Sarah blinked, her mind trying to process the shift. She was no longer standing in that empty plain, no longer tethered to the house's twisted reflection of reality. She was in a place of peace, a place that felt real. The oppressive weight was gone, and in its place there was only calm. The world before her seemed unspoiled, pure, untouched by the shadows that had once consumed her. She took a step forward, and the ground beneath her was solid, real. The shadows no longer lingered at the edges of her vision. The sense of being watched, the constant feeling of dread that had haunted her for as long as she could remember, was gone. And as she walked forward, Sarah realized something. She had never truly escaped the house. Not because it was still in her, but because the house had never been about the walls, the floors, the stone. The house had always been inside her. It was her fears, her guilt, her memories. It was the part of herself she had refused to face, but now she had faced it. She had confronted it. She had won. For the first time in her life, she was free. The chains that had bound her, both the physical and the emotional, were shattered. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah knew that she was no longer defined by the darkness. She was no longer defined by the house. She was her own. The world around her shifted again, but this time it was different. The landscape ahead was peaceful, calm. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The winds were gentle, and the trees rustled softly, as if in quiet reverence. This time, when Sarah took a deep breath, she felt the air fill her lungs without resistance, without fear. It was as though her soul had been cleansed, washed of the years of suffering and terror that had built up inside of her. She didn't need to run anymore. She didn't need to hide. She was home, finally, truly home. And with that realization, Sarah took the first step into her new life, knowing that she had the strength to shape it however she chose. The house was gone, and so was its shadow. The last remnants of the darkness vanished, leaving nothing but light. Sarah stood there, her feet rooted in the earth, as the quiet winds of the new world whispered through the trees around her. The horizon stretched out before her like an uncharted path, one that could lead anywhere, to any possibility. She had no idea where it would take her, but for the first time in her life she felt a sense of peace, a sense of true freedom. The weight that had once burdened her every step, every breath was gone. The house, its hunger, its suffocating presence, its twisted grip on her, had been nothing but an echo now. Its shadows had finally faded, not only from the world, but from her mind and heart. The cold, creeping fear that had once curled like smoke in her thoughts had dissipated, replaced by the warmth of something far greater, hope. It was a strange feeling, a foreign one, after everything she had been through. She had spent so long running from the shadows, so long caged by the remnants of the house's influence, that she had forgotten what it was like to feel the sun on her skin, to breathe freely, without the weight of 1,000 fears pressing down on her chest. But now she was alive. The breeze carried the scent of earth and flowers, fresh and vibrant, and she could hear the soft rustling of leaves as they swayed in the gentle wind. It was the kind of natural rhythm that she had been deprived of for so long, like a reminder that life, despite everything, had continued in the world outside the house. The world was still turning, still moving forward, and she too was finally moving forward with it. For so long, Sarah had been haunted by the spectre of the house, as if it were an inescapable part of her. She had tried to run, to escape, but each time it had dragged her back. She had thought that by destroying the stone, by breaking the physical ties to the house, she would be free. And yet she had discovered that it was never about the house at all. It had been about her. The house had been an extension of her fears, her pain, her unresolved grief and guilt. It had been a reflection of the broken pieces she had never dared to face. But now, standing in this quiet, open space, Sarah realized that she had faced it all. She had confronted the darkest parts of herself, the parts that the house had fed on, and she had finally let them go. The weight of her past no longer defined her. She was no longer a victim. She was free. Her heart swelled with the possibility of what could come next. The future, once a distant, terrifying concept, now seemed like a blank canvas, waiting for her to paint it. She could go anywhere. She could be anyone. And for the first time, she realized that the power to shape her life was entirely in her hands. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the land. Sarah had no destination in mind, but she no longer needed one. She was not running from anything anymore. She was walking toward everything. As she took her first step forward, the earth beneath her seemed to pulse with her own heartbeat. The ground felt solid, sure. There were no cracks, no fissures. It was as if the world itself had risen to meet her, offering her stability, offering her strength. The shadows that had clung to her heels for so long were now nothing more than fleeting memories fading like mist in the morning light. Her steps were light. Her breath was steady. She walked, knowing now that she was not alone. The world was full of possibility, full of life, and she was a part of it. She didn't need to be afraid. The house had no hold on her anymore. And then, as she moved farther, from the place where she had once been bound, Sarah felt a shift in the air around her. It was subtle, like a ripple on the surface of a pond, but it was enough to make her pause and look back. Behind her, the land had started to change again. The world she had left behind, the one full of shadows and terror, began to fade. It dissolved into the distance, retreating like a memory being buried under time, a fading ghost that no longer had the power to haunt her. It was gone, swept away by the power of her own will. But as the old world dissolved, something new began to take shape before her eyes. The landscape shimmered with light, bright and full of life. It was as though the earth itself had been reborn, made new by the very act of Sarah's freedom. The trees stood taller, their branches stretching toward the heavens, their leaves vibrant and green. Flowers bloomed at her feet, delicate petals unfurling to greet her, like the earth itself was celebrating her release. In the distance, a small cottage appeared, nestled at the base of a mountain that rose majestically against the horizon. It was a simple structure made of stone and wood, with a small garden at the front. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, signaling the warmth inside. She didn't know how long she stood there, simply taking it all in. The new world, the new beginning, the sense of peace that had settled around her like a blanket. But when she finally took a step forward, she knew exactly where she was going. The cottage was waiting for her. She wasn't sure if anyone lived there. She wasn't sure if it was real or simply a product of her mind, a symbol of everything she had worked toward. But it didn't matter. It was her home now, her place, a space she had created for herself, a place of warmth and solace, a sanctuary where she could finally be herself. The door to the cottage stood open, welcoming her, and as she crossed the threshold, Sarah felt the last of the weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't burdened by fear or guilt anymore. She wasn't running from anything. She had found her way to this moment, to this new life, and it was hers to embrace. Inside the cottage, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, artifacts, and mementos, things that held no power over her now, but served as reminders of her journey. There was a table set with fresh flowers, a small vase of daisies, and a bowl of fruit that filled the air with sweetness. As she sank into a chair by the fire, Sarah closed her eyes and sighed deeply, her hands resting on the soft fabric of the chair's arms. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. Her heart was light, and her soul was free. The shadows had no place in her life anymore. Outside, the sun began to rise, casting its light over the world as the first rays of morning broke through the sky. It was the dawn of something new, something beautiful. And Sarah was there, standing on the threshold of her future, no longer burdened by the weight of the past. She was free, and with that, she understood the final truth. There was no final door anymore. She had created the path before her. She was the architect of her own fate, and for the first time, she walked forward with no fear, only hope. Sarah sat in the chair by the fire, watching as the flames danced with a slow, steady rhythm. The warmth of the hearth wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, and the crackling sound of the wood settling into the fire filled the silence in a way that was peaceful, not oppressive. Outside, the world was quiet, bathed in the soft light of early morning. It was a new day, a day without the looming shadow of the house. For the first time in years, Sarah felt truly at peace. Her mind no longer raced with frantic thoughts, and the memories of the house, the nightmare she had lived, no longer held the sharp sting they once did. The weight of them had lifted, as though a burden she hadn't even realized she had been carrying had simply vanished. The echoes of the past, of the pain, the fear, the hunger of the house, faded into nothingness like fog dissolving under the rising sun. She could still remember the dark halls, the oppressive walls, the suffocating grip of that endless hunger. But now, the memories felt distant, muted, as if they were someone else's experience entirely. The house had been a part of her, yes, but it no longer defined her. She ran a hand through her hair, which now fell freely around her shoulders. She had always kept it tied back in the past, a reflection of the restraints she had placed on herself, the walls she had built. Now it hung loose, untethered, just like her, free. For so long she had been a prisoner to the darkness, the house, the memories, the guilt. It had all tangled together, forming a web she couldn't break free from. But now, sitting in the warmth of the cottage, she realized how far she had come, how much she had survived. She closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly, allowing herself to feel the fullness of the silence. The peace that filled the room was so different from the constant hum of anxiety she had lived with before. It was a silence that wasn't hollow but whole, the kind of quiet that you could sink into and feel your soul breathe again. There was no more running, no more fighting. The battle was over, and she had won. Not because she had destroyed the house, but because she had faced it, everything it represented, and chosen to walk away from it. She had chosen herself. Outside, the sun was rising higher now, the golden light spilling over the landscape, illuminating the trees and the rolling hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. The colors of the world seemed richer now, more vibrant, as if the earth itself had come alive after a long sleep. The air smelled of fresh earth, pine, and something sweet, a reminder that the world could still be beautiful, even after everything had been torn apart. The garden outside the cottage bloomed with wildflowers, their petals reaching for the sun, their colors so bright it almost hurt to look at them. Birds flitted from tree to tree, their songs filling the air with a melody that felt like music for the soul. Sarah could hear the faint sound of a stream trickling nearby, the water flowing clear and unbroken over the rocks. Everything around her felt alive, vibrant and whole, and she was part of it. She stood up slowly, moving toward the window to look outside once more. The land stretched out before her, endless and open. For the first time, Sarah didn't feel small in this world. She didn't feel like a victim of some cruel fate. She was part of it all, this world, this moment, this life. She had always thought that the house was a prison, that it was the source of her pain, her struggle, her suffering, and it had been. But it had also been the catalyst for her transformation. It had forced her to confront everything she had buried, every part of herself she had refused to face. It had broken her in ways she hadn't understood until now. But that was over. She had faced the darkness. She had faced herself. And now, there was nothing left to do but live. A soft smile tugged at her lips as she turned from the window. The room inside the cottage was simple, modest even, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every small detail had been placed with care, with the intention of creating a space that was hers alone. She had no need for grandeur. She had no need for the things that once defined her. What she had now was the freedom to choose. She could go anywhere. She could stay here. Or she could continue walking toward the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a never-ending line of possibility. There was no more fear of what the future held, because now she knew that she could shape it, she could make it her own. The fire crackled again, the flames flickering with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. And for the first time, she truly listened. She listened to the sound of her breath, to the silence in the room, to the world beyond the walls of the cottage. Everything was as it should be. Everything was in its place. She was whole. The house had been part of her story, but it was no longer the chapter that defined her. She had turned the page. She had written the next part of her life. With one last look at the horizon, Sarah stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the earth beneath her feet. She took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. There were no more shadows behind her. There was only light. The light that came from within her, from the strength she had discovered in herself. The light that had been there all along. She was free. She had always been free. And as she walked forward into the open world, she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead was hers to make. The house no longer had any hold over her. Now she was free to be whoever she wanted to be. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, she knew that there was nothing she couldn't face.